So I'd say that's a positive sign. My stream preview is showing me that nice, pretty Dwarf Fortress logo. Temples existed the last time I played. They're not that new. They weren't quite as, how shall I say this, obligatory as they are going to be in the current release by virtue of the stress impact that they have. So there's going to be a little figuring out as we go there, because while I'd set up temples before, I was kind of leaving that as to last because it was a purely optional thing at the time, and it ain't optional no more. So we get to deal with it. That's not a big deal. Contrary to what I normally would have done, I'll probably take picks out of the gate and just start down to the stone layer right off the bat. Get a dining hall and a uh, temple area, temple atrium. Let's call it an atrium dugout, so that we can put temples off of that in a circle, and then we'll just start putting temples around that in a ring, depending on how many we need. I mean, it's going to depend on the dwarves. Obviously, I haven't looked at the world we're going to generate yet. We'll give it a few minutes. I originally said I'd start up at about 7:30, and I wasn't quite ready to get done that quickly. I still don't have a few things set up for the full event, so I don't have the call out set up on uh, the stream, and I don't have the overlays set up for Extra Life. I've got to get all that stuff up and running. I figure we can do that tomorrow. No big. Thank you for taking a look at the thread. By the way, I knew something was up when I went back and checked on it a couple days later, and it only had one upvote. I was like, wow, really, guys? That's harsh, harsh, man. Came back a few days later and it wasn't there, or I couldn't find it, and still had no upvotes. And I was like, what the hell? Hey guys, still got about 10 minutes to live. I mean, really live, like me doing something live. Well, that's okay, Demke. Technically, neither have I. So, Demke, when was the last time you actually played Dwarf Fortress? Because I can tell you when the last time I technically played was like a week ago, but the reality is I really haven't played in the last couple of years. I've been really tied up with other stuff. But most of what I've done in the past is going to hold. There's going to be a few things we'll have to do in a different order or more quickly than I would have in prior examples. Oh, we'll see if you've played 3 months ago. You've played more recently than I have. This will be fun. You'll get to point out all the stuff I'm doing wrong. In the past, if you go back and you look at prior broadcasts, a lot of the stuff Toadie's done in the recent in the past year have been to radically amp up the stress impact on dwarves. For example, is the primary one that comes to mind as far as running your fortress goes. It's probably a little bugged at the moment, but Toadie's going to fix it eventually, I assume. Chances are good we'll tantrum spiral out a few times until I can get a handle on exactly how much it's changed. But previous streams we would have done things like left temples to last. You can't do that anymore. That's temples have to be out there pretty quickly in order to keep your dwarves in check. We would have written a manager off. I might have given him an set up a manager but no office because all I wanted him for was to use the manager queue. Uh, we're gonna change a lot of how we would have played in the past to fit these new changes. As far as I know, though, things like the uh, bartenders serve your dwarves alcohol until they die of alcohol poisoning. Uh, that bug, as far as I know, still hasn't been fixed. So no bartenders. Gotta cut down on the number of performers. We'll see. Since I'm going to be doing this for like 30 days straight, 33 for you at home watchers. Since I'm going to do this for like 33 days straight, though, we're going to have to do some things along the way to spice things up because if I do things the way I normally do, it's fairly non threatening aside from the changes that have been done for stress. Yeah, the last update's been a long time ago, around the time I was kind of really begging off doing the stream last year. Technically, what you've really missed is not so much the new Dwarf Fortress stuff, it's, my inability to adapt to it. So you get to laugh and point. That's what really sells it, after all, right? Laughing and pointing at the guy on stream who's doing it wrong. Yeah, like I said, I knew stress was broke. Just don't put the booze in the tavern zone. Yeah, that works. It'll slow them down enough. Will the bartenders actually leave the tavern zone to get booze? I thought they would only serve the booze that was stocked in the tavern. And the other possibility that comes to mind is using a really small booze stockpile. And if the bartender has to go, I'd have to look. I haven't looked at the mechanics of this, but if the bartender actually has to pick up a mug along the way as well, then the possibility exists to put the small booze stockpile in one corner of the room and the mug stockpile in the other corner of the room and let them take care of themselves. Effectively using the pathfinding time against the multiple servings per round issue. And I don't figure that'll matter tonight because I don't figure we'll get as far as a tavern in this first couple hours. First couple hours, we'll be lucky if we get much past setting up an Embark after I answer questions and run through World Gen and See, now that's going a little further than I would, but I mean, right? You could. I mean, people have done it with the whole trap bridge where somebody walks onto the bridge and the pressure plates basically keep them there while you shoot them with arrows. Of course, come to think of it, I'm not sure I've tested the old school trap bridge with the double-ended pressure plates anymore. With climbing, I wonder whether the AI will eventually get tired of walking back and forth and attempt to climb its way out of the problem. No, heck with that. If we're worried about climbing their way out, you do it with bridges. That way, if they actually do manage to somehow climb their way out of the problem at the same time somebody activates the pressure plate, they get crushed, they are out of the game. Nobody ever notices. Problem solved. Smart dwarves get the hammer. All right, let's see if this is still working. See if I remember how to do this. Okay, so hi guys. It's been like literally 2 years since I've done this. So apologies in advance for any rough edges as I go through this all from start. But since it's crept up on me again this year, like it does pretty much every year, and this year I kind of committed myself to something a little more grand than I have in years previous, I'm still not entirely ready for the stream anyway. But screw it, we'll do it live. So, hi guys, welcome to How to Dwarf Fortress. If you've never done this with us before, what I'm going to do tonight is pretty well walk you through how I set up Dwarf Fortress from the Lazy Noob Pack. It's how I set up my Embarks, how I set up my profile to actually pick out my dwarves. We'll run a world gen. I'll discuss how to modify world gen to kind of get what you want. Uh, Once we've got a world generated and we've started, we'll probably have run through our time this evening, and then I'll leave off there for tomorrow. Uh, I'm intending to do 33 of these broadcasts in a row, culminating in a 24-hour live stream on November 2nd for the benefit of my local children's hospital. I'm going to, along the way, demonstrate everything from start to finish on a basic fort, and then depending on how things go, whether they're exciting or not. Yes, it's the same background. Of course, it's the same background. Why would I change it? It's awesome. Plus, I'm old, and change is to horrible, right? So to start with, let's talk about what you get when you run the Lazy Noob pack. So once you've run it, you're going to get this interface, which comes up and gives you some basic options for your fort. Now, all of these things are available to you in options files in the Dwarf Fortress subdirect. Specifically, you can go into the init folder, and under init and dinit are some of these options that we'll be editing. You can edit them there directly as long as you're careful, but it's easier generally to do it through the interface unless you're trying to do something particularly advanced. Likewise, World Gen has a lot of these options that we'll be touching later, and it's where you can find the World Gen settings that you've saved along the way. You can page through and edit any of these you like. In fact, we'll probably touch the announcements folder or the announcements file at least once in order to turn off certain announcements that I find annoying. But I'll cover that in a bit. In the meantime, let's talk about the interface. Right out of the gate, these first few are going to be particularly important as you advance later in the game. They don't sound like much at first, and PopCap sounds like something you wouldn't really care about, but Dwarf Fortress is a single-threaded process. I don't care how fast your new multi-core monster rig is. It's still running on a single thread, which means one core gets to run it. It doesn't matter so much how many cores you have. What matters is how fast that individual core can run Dwarf Fortress. Pathfinding, which is a lot of what happens in Dwarf Fortress, has to be handled sequentially with most of the other most of the other game functions. And so, what ends up happening as your population increases is that it basically bogs the game to a halt. Too large a population cap, too large a visitor cap, too large an invader cap, and sooner or later you're going to have a siege while you've got 40 performers all trying to perform in your temple, and you've got 250 dwarves on screen, and your rig is going to have an absolute catatonic moment. Your frame rate's going to drop to zero, and your fort's effectively going to be frame rate dead because it just simply takes longer to run a frame than a second to pass. You'll be getting seconds per frame rather than frames per second. So we need to keep these things kind of reasonable. In the past, I would have turned them up, but as the game has gotten more complex, and it was complex to start, it's gotten harder and harder to maintain those high population caps that I might have used in the past. I've used 20 or 200 as a soft cap and 220 as a hard cap in the past. Uh, with the addition of visitors and the increase in uh, invasions and sieges and so forth, it's important to keep those things under control. Uh, Pretty sure this is close to vanilla. Now, a couple of these things deserve special mention. If you turn invaders off, that will end all sieges and so forth. Nobody will come and wreck up your fortress. That can be great if you're a starting player and you really are just wanting to focus on something like farming. You don't want to do it in a live fortress. You want to take as much time as you need to do it. You could turn invaders off and get around them that way. Uh, Generally speaking, though, if you're playing the game for any kind of challenge or enjoyment beyond just how do I build a mega project or how do I farm or how do I brew booze, you're probably going to want to leave that on. 90% of the game is in being able to defend yourself and respond to some of these invasions and such, and so it's important to actually have them occur. Otherwise, you're never going to get the opportunity. Uh, Cave-ins, weather, and artifacts I leave on. Artifacts are whether your dwarves have special moods to produce, artifacts in the Tolkien sense of the word. Weather is important if you plan to enjoy any of the evil weather types, like blood rain, or good weather types like beer rain. Cave-ins are whether you want to have old school floating building Minecraft construction, or whether you want to have, call it, semi-realistic funsics. As long as your stuff is supported, Dwarf Fortress doesn't check for like structural integrity to see whether you've got a giant single block of dirt holding up your entire fortress. People have built entire fortresses supported on a block made out of soap, surrounded by water. Um, it's up to you whether you want to turn them off. Generally speaking, I leave them on. They don't come up that often, and dwarves are relatively smart about cave-ins as long as the player doesn't get too rambunctious with their designations. Temperature is important if you want things to catch fire. If you turn that off, magma is not hot. Your dwarves can happily go for a swim in lava and they won't care. If you turn temperature off and then turn temperature back on, you can get all kinds of weird effects, like dwarves who went for a swim in lava suddenly being covered in lava coatings and bursting into flames spontaneously because the lava that wasn't hot before now is. If you turn it off, leave it off. If you turn it on, you probably want to leave it on unless you have frame rate effects. Temperature is one of the things that can cause frame rates to chug later. If you're doing advanced engineering like a dwarven lava elevator to move lava to the top, the temperature recalculation necessary to move that lava from the ground floor all the way up to wherever you're going to deposit it, it calculates temperature at every square along the way that the lava touches, and that can be a lot of squares. So in addition to the frame rate chug of the machinery that you're using for that pump stack, you're also going to have all the temperature recalculations of the lava trying to heat up all the surrounding rock as it moves in and out of every square along the way. Entomb Pets is, I think, on by default, but I turn it off every time. This is whether you want animals in your fortress to automatically get coffins or not if they're pets. Now, if you're being particularly nice to your dwarves, being able to have graves for your pets is not a bad thing. But this option is the default. It's not a question of whether you want to allow it at all. The question is whether you want to have it on by default. And the problem with leaving it on by default is you can have a siege come in and kill 5 dwarves and 200 cats, and the 200 cats get buried first. And then you have a bunch of people really pissed off that they didn't bury their friends before they got rotted. So, in order to work around that, I'll entomb special pets when I feel like they need it, and the rest of them can go on the refuse pile or get used into kitten sausage. I don't care. We will probably won't assign many pets to begin with. With the current way that stress is working in the game, it's anything that creates more stress is not a good thing, and having your pets die is a good source of additional stress. So while having a pet is nice, having your gerbil get stepped on by a cave troll can end up with your entire fortress crumbling because Bob hasn't had a nice shower in the last 3 months. Aquifers are nice if you want to deal with them, and a pain in the ass if you don't. And generally speaking, I'm here to play and not so much engage in dwarven mechanical engineering, and so I generally don't screw around with them. However, a few words on aquifers. Aquifers are an infinite supply of water, and anything that is an infinite supply of safe water is also an infinite supply of dwarven mechanical energy in the form of water mills. So if you have an aquifer, you not only have an infinite supply of drinking water, but you have an infinite supply of ways to power your fortress. So if you're envisioning something that involves a dwarven computer or powered mine carts, or perhaps maybe some sort of automated goblin grinding system, you're going to probably want to have a way to generate that power. Now, you could do it a few different ways using, say, an on site river that you drain through uh, fortifications and bars and other sorts of things into a reservoir that you refill periodically or the like. But aquifers allow you to do that without having any sort of external exposure to your fortress and effectively give you an infinite internal source of water. Uh, Additionally, aquifers act as an infinite drain. So, for those of you who are looking for a place to stash your water and get rid of it, well, you can drain as much water into an aquifer as you like. They will happily absorb it. So, they have their uses, but generally speaking, for new players, I'd recommend turning them off. You can always re-enable them later, just not on the world you're playing. That option has to be set for each world as you are uh, generating the world, basically. So, generally speaking, I wouldn't turn that on unless you are ready to deal with them. There's a wiki article out there specifically on how to deal with aquifers. I recommend all players go out and read it if you plan to mess with them. Grazing coefficients are this is how much food animals need relative to normal. Now, I haven't looked at it recently, but certain animals, like, say, elephants in the past, couldn't actually eat enough to feed themselves. You could have the elephant standing on a square of grass all day, every day, and the time it took to move from square to square was enough to starve the elephant over time. Uh, at that point, you could have modified this to make your elephants need a little less food and everything else along the way so that grazing was a little more palatable. We probably won't use any elephants, so this probably isn't going to come up for us. If you're using large grazers, cattle, uh, maybe even alpaca, for example, or elephants or hippos or other large ruminants, then you might want to consider looking at whether it's actually feasible in the current version, and I haven't checked, I admit, for them to actually survive grazing on their own normally. Since Toady hasn't implemented feeding your farmyard animals yet, your dwarves will happily let them starve in a pasture rather than feed them some surplus plump helmets. So it's on you to kind of keep an eye on that. Since I don't use many large animals, I normally don't mess with it. But if you're trying to build a zoo or some additional project like that, it may become important to you. Starting labors determine what skills your dwarves will have when they show up as migrants or when they're first placed on the map, if you will. Skills is generally what I like to have them set as. Uh, that means if a dwarf has skill in cheese making, he comes in with the cheese making skill turned on. That means if I forget to check on him and I don't remember that I have cheesemakers that just arrived in the last migration wave, or perhaps I'm a little busy with that siege that they're interrupting, then he's at least set up to do something productive in the meantime. Even if he, assuming he makes it past the siege and doesn't stop to pick up a sock and get impaled. Once he's in the fortress, of course, I'll need to set him up more properly, but this way at least he's not a completely non-productive drain. You can also have this set to no, which means that all starting dwarves have all their labors turned off. That does make them a starting drain, but it also means that they don't, I don't know, start jumping in on your workshops ahead of the guy who has all the skill and start producing low quality furniture that you don't want them to produce. There are ways around that problem, but this is a much more global solution. See, and I don't mind Fisher Dwarves. We're going to actually build, if we settle on someplace with a river anyway, for sure, we will build a little fishing shack for them to fish in, where they can do all their fishing without having to expose our fortress to the world at large, if you will. It's not perfect, but we'll do it. Let's see. What else does that leave on the first page here? You can set up your key bindings. I normally don't mess with those. You can select a set of Embark profiles if you have them created. On the graphics options, not sure what it defaults to. I think it defaults to ASCII, but don't quote me. I set for Phoebus. Those of you who don't like the Phoebus tile set, I apologize in advance. It's what I've learned on, and I haven't had enough time in the last 2 years to switch off to something newer. There are several tile sets out here. I encourage you to experiment with them until you find one that you like, and my apologies in advance if you don't happen to like the one that I do. But since this is what I learned on, this is what I stick with. Liquid depth will tell you how deep water is. This is relevant for dwarves. If dwarves are sitting in water and it's depth 3, they're standing. If it's in water and it's depth 4, they're swimming. If they're in water and there's a roof over their head and it's depth 7, they're technically drowning. Well, swimming technically, but dwarves don't swim very well normally, so drowning probably. You want to know how deep water is so you know whether it's dangerous for your dwarves, as well as to know how full your well is and things like that. I normally leave this on. However, if you're looking to take very aesthetically pleasing screenshots, having a bunch of numbers show up in the middle of your otherwise pristine tile set might not be what you like, in which case you can flip this on and off on the fly to have this work. You might have to restart Dwarf Fortress, but it'll actually allow you to take a screenshot of your fortress with no liquid depth and then flip it back on when you're playing. Varied ground is for those of you who are playing with ASCII, it's whether you only see periods or whether you get a more varied, periods and commas kind of uh, graphic style to the ground. Since we're using a tile set, it's not super relevant for us, but we'll leave it on varied ground anyway because it'll make the ground itself look less like a uniform Minecraft map and more like there's some actual grass variation, different plants and such around. We'll hide our engravings. They'll all look the same. If you turn this off by default, then your engravings have different images in the ASCII. I'll be honest with you, I don't think I've ever turned it off for uh, tile sets. I'm sure that different tile sets may have different engraving options, but I don't know that we'll care. The quality of improvement of items is whether we show like the pluses and stars to show what the item quality is, and we'll get into that later. And normally I'd leave this on so I know how good the item is that I'm dealing with. If I'm trying to sell something, it's important for me to know, is this a masterwork item that's worth a lot of money, or is this a, useless item that my last cheesemaker came in and made before I got him settled? Print mode text will be text, allows me to have ASCII in certain places and graphics in other, and allows me also to have things like multi-level depth, so if I'm looking down a hillside, I see multiple levels down the hillside, and rather than just the single level that I'm looking at. For those of you who are familiar with Dwarf Fortress's Z levels, if you imagine a hill being sliced horizontally, parallel to the ground, if you will, those are Z levels as you go up and down. So your hill looks more like a series of circles. When you have multi-level display on, instead of seeing the circles as you're looking at the top of the hill, you'll actually see the top of the hill and then the outside edge of the level below that and the outside edge of the level below that. So it looks like a much more three-dimensional hill. And by default, it'll display, I think, 4 levels of depth before it fades out below where it lets you see. This gives your fortress, especially if your fortress has any kind of two-dimensional, or excuse me, three-dimensional uh, vertical representation, it allows your fortress to have a three-dimensional view, even in the two-dimensional representation that you get in the game screen. Normally, I wouldn't mess with this, but if it's causing you problems, you might have to. Uh, Under utilities, we will turn on some of these. Normally, I use Quick Fort. We'll disable it right now because I don't want it to turn on automatically. When you use Quick Fort, it traps certain keystrokes from the keyboard, and it can interfere with your ability to use other programs while it's active because some of the keystrokes it uses are things that are used by other things. So normally I'll turn Quick Forward on and run it when I need it, and then immediately turn it off when I'm not using it. And you can pause it so it doesn't, or suspend the hotkey so it doesn't notice it. But chances are good we're never going to get to Quick Forward tonight anyway, and it won't be relevant. Dwarf Therapist is one of the things I would consider personally indispensable. I do not run Dwarf Fortress without Dwarf Therapist. When I very first started playing Dwarf Fortress, I played Dwarf Fortress without Dwarf Therapist. And I did so for a couple of days, which I consider an exercise in masochism and carpal tunnel syndrome induction. I literally do not play Dwarf Fortress during the period following a release until the open source versions of Dwarf Therapist have found the memory offsets and updated. I simply am not going to go in and out of the incredibly obtuse menu system in Dwarf Fortress to set labors and uh, organization of my fortress any more than I absolutely have to. I know that it's not really a primary focus for Toady, and hey, it's his game. I get it. I'm cool. But the current implementation is absolutely carpal tunnel syndrome inducing, and I'm shocked, frankly, that it hasn't started to affect his ability to produce. So I don't play that game. We'll do all of our labor setting in Dwarf Therapist, and we'll organize dwarves in groups, we'll sort them and filter them, and I'll show you how that one works extensively because we'll be using it heavily. Sound Sense will handle all of our game sound. So we'll get to hear our dwarves sparring, we'll get to hear them bitching when the stress gets to be too much, we'll get to hear them groan despondently when they finally get depressed and wander off to die. Sound Sense will handle all that. In addition, it will also provide some background music beyond the guitar thread that is present in the base game of Dwarf Fortress. I believe it's Toady that's actually playing the music there, and no offense to Toady, it's a lovely song, but after a few hours of it, you're going to want to claw your eyeballs out. So you probably want to consider getting some sort of background music. If not Toady's, you're going to want to put something on. Dwarf Fortress is silent pretty much other than that. So it's important that we think about how we're going to represent this game in order to allow us to kind of stay engaged with it. Additionally, SoundSense basically scans the game log for your game. So it's constantly monitoring what's going on in real time, what events are happening, and it will actually display sounds appropriate to that. So when my dwarves start sparring and sparring events happen, you're going to hear a lot of swords clanging. When dwarves start creating masterworks, there's notifications for that. And we'll probably, in a late game fortress, have to turn some of that stuff down or off because at some point it gets to the point where you've always got dwarves sparring, so there's always swords clanking, and you've always got master dwarves doing masterworks, so there's always masterwork notifications blaring, and eventually it starts to become a little bit spammy. So some of that may have to get turned down later. But initially, you're starting 7, hell, you're starting 30. You're not going to be generating notifications fast enough for it to matter or for you to care. And having them on is a great way to keep track of what's going on in your fortress beyond trying to scroll manually through the notifications and reports screens. Those are wonderful and they have their place, especially if you're trying to figure out what's going on in detail. But frankly, we listen to sound in games is for those oral cues that tell us what's going on, and Sound Sense allows Dwarf Fortress to communicate with the player in that same fashion. So those things I use always. Legends Viewer is, I'm assuming this. I've noticed now I've got World Viewer, Legends Viewer, and Legends Browser, and I think Legends Viewer was the last one I used. When we create a world, we're also going to export some basic XML files that have world data in them. Legends Viewer will allow us to view that data as though it were Legends mode in Dwarf Fortress. And that can be useful if you want to know more about civilizations in your world, if you want to know where they're located, where the cities are. If you're going to play an adventure mode character on your Dwarf Fortress mode world, you might want to know where the nearest fort is to your fort so that you can leave your fort and arrive somewhere useful. Uh, if you plan to leave yourself goodies in fortress mode that you can pillage in adventure mode, you're going to need to be able to export that map in order to be able to know where you're at on the map more clearly. Uh, Additionally, if you want to know how many elves are left in the world or how many times your dwarves have had their asses kicked by goblins since you took over the civilization, that's all included there as well. It'll tell you how many necromancers there are. It'll tell you about the gods in your world and what sort of things they represent. It allows you to basically peek into World Gen at a data level and kind of look around. None of it is actually spoiler information in the sense that it's going to affect how your fortress runs. If you're playing adventure mode, some of it might be spoiler sensitive in the sense that it will tell you where artifacts are located, and you could then immediately go to them and try to dig them out if you wanted. But realistically, if you're playing adventure mode and you're not looking at that stuff occasionally, you're probably not going anywhere or doing much of anything, I suspect. Toady is continuing to work towards adventure mode and fort mode being unified so that you'll be able to build your fortress in adventure mode. For those of you who are tired of playing Minecraft in 3D and now want to do it in 2D, well, you'll be able to eventually, someday, maybe. So that's utilities in a nutshell. Now let's see, advanced options. I turn sound in the game off because we're using Sound Sense. I leave the intro movie on and I leave it in windowed mode because I'll have to tab in and out constantly to use the various utilities. Resolution is if you want to change the actual tiles per page, if you will, then that's where you would do it. Normally, I wouldn't mess with this stuff. In full screen, you want it to auto detect. If you're in windowed mode, you probably want to have a certain fixed display. That's what we'll achieve. We'll leave the frame rate counter on so that you'll know exactly how hard that siege is killing my frame rate on my current rig. If you need to know the difference here, calculation frames per second means that this thing is calculating 2 frames, but it's only showing me half of those. It's calculating them at this speed and showing me that half of that and keeps them in that ratio. I turn autosaves on. Dwarf Fortress is relatively stable, even on newer versions normally. Not guaranteed with the newest versions, but newer versions. Having an autosave set to seasonal means that if I lose progress, I'm not losing any more than a season. That's relatively acceptable. That's still a couple of months of dwarf time, so that's still a lot of time to lose, but it's not terrible. Pause on save is whether you want the game to pause after a save completes. Normally I leave that off, but your mileage may vary. Saves can take a while depending on your rig and how, what kind of hard drive you're running. It's not usually a problem, but if you're saving a really big site on a really big world, it can take a bit to save. And if you want it to be able to get up and go grab a soda and come back and not have your game run away, turn that on. Backup saves allows me to keep a rolling backup of all the seasonal autosaves. So if at any point I decided I wanted to roll back a year or a season or 2 seasons or 3 years or 3 seasons and 2 years, I can do that. I can roll back to any of the autosaves it has. If you turn that off, then it will autosave seasonally, but it'll use the same slot and it'll constantly be overwriting. That might not be a problem if you don't ever intend to go back and look at your fortress along the way in terms of development. But if you've ever been curious about how your fortress kind of played out, one of those post game, how did my fortress run scenarios where your fortress is kind of evolving before your eyes, the autosaves allow you a way to fire the game up, take a peek at where things were at any given moment in your fortress, so that you know how long it took you in terms of years and months to complete your manual your mega project or to dig your well and piping system. So there are uses to being able to have that. But if your hard drive space is limited, you probably don't need the backup saves. They're just chewing up additional space. Initial save gives me the ability to roll back to where I first launched my fort. If I ever want to go back and replay the same site twice, having an initial save means that I'll always have that save where my fort was when I first embarked it on day one. And I can come back and rerun the same fort as many times as I like. Pause on load keeps the game from running off when it first loads because loading a game can take a long time, just like saving a game can. Normally, I'd leave save compression on. There's not usually a reason to turn that off. It sometimes people say it helps their stability. I'll be honest with you, I've never noticed a difference. It's one of those things where it works often enough that I don't care. I leave it on. Newer versions, like when Toady launches a new release and all the utilities are still updating and it's fresh out of the pan, as it were, compressed saves might be a thing you turn off, but otherwise I'd probably leave them on always. I can't think of a case where you're ever going to want it off. You can remove your save games manually. You go into the save game folder, you purge what you've got there. This is something I was tinkering with the other day. Uh, just a random world I was creating to see if I still remembered how to do it, and sure enough, I do. To delete a save, all you do is select the region that it was, and you hit delete, and poof, it's gone. We no longer have a region 1. We'll create one from scratch. These two announcements are the ones I normally turn off or on depending on what I'm doing. If you're going to be working around a river, you probably want to turn Dampstone off. If you're going to be working around Warmstone, you probably want to turn the announcement off. There's more detail to this, so we'll jump into that one in just a second. And normally I'm going to have them set this way. Warmstone notifies me when I've found magma, and Dampstone notifies me before I flood my fortress. Hundreds and hundreds of dwarves can be killed if you make the wrong mistake when you're digging around lava or water, and so those announcements can come in handy. But if you know what you're doing and you know exactly where the water is and you're very careful about how you're digging, having those announcements on can be really problematic because your dwarves will constantly be canceling jobs and recentering your view and jerking you away from what you were trying to do to let you know that the 14th tile in a row was directly adjacent to a river, which you already knew because you told them to dig it out adjacent to the river. You don't want that. I don't want that. The dwarves don't want that. So set your announcements the way you want them. DF hack options, out of the box, I think the only one that's turned on is multi-level view, and it's normally the only one that I'll use. If you're tinkering, if you're a new player and you want to see Dwarf Fortress in kind of a story mode sort of setting, you could turn on automatic job assignments. That will basically free you from the need to tell your dwarves to do any particular labor. The DF hack utilities will effectively set your dwarves to do tasks as needed. I can't promise that they run your fortress efficiently or effectively, but you can guarantee that no job is going to sit there undone simply because no dwarf is assigned to do that particular task. That doesn't mean the job will get done. There might be too many jobs and not enough dwarves, but they'll at least have the opportunity to do the job. For those of you who are wanting to know what your fortress might look like in Minecraft or something similar with a three-dimensional visualizer, Stone Sense's isometric view allows you to view your fortress in an isometric 3D view. We'll see about tinkering with that somewhere down the road in this 30-day stream. I've got a lot of time to fill in 30 days, and a lot of these things I normally don't mess with, like Perfect World, I may spend some time off camera tinkering with just so I can come back and explain how they work for new players. But it's not something we're going to tinker with out of the box. Now, DF hack is one of the things that, again, out of the box, I normally don't leave home without. There are simply too many nice, pretty, friendly utilities out there. Too many plugins, too many nice quality of life fixes, too many things to turn my nose up at DF hack. Now, I can play Dwarf Fortress without DF hack. It's nice to have, not must have. But it's so nice to have that it borders on it. Now, while I'll skip Dwarf Fortress until the therapist updates, I've dove in. I've dived in a few times where DF hack is still pending on a few things. The downsides are that you're going to lose out on some of the more advanced functionality that's not really in the game and it's only supported through their plugins. Most of that stuff you're probably not going to actually require. It's nice to have, not need to have. And we'll use it, but maybe not as much in the past now that Toady started to implement some of these features in the base game. Things like the manager queues and things that Workflow used to handle will now be handled through the manager. And that's pretty much the quick overview. Now, That thing about the announcements that I keep saying I'm going to get to and we'll talk about it, but I never quite actually get there. Yeah, we're going to get there now. Now, all of these init files in Dwarf Fortress are purely text files. It doesn't matter which one I open. Init, world init, init, dinit, world gen, doesn't matter. They're all plain text files. And they're all organized along the same general principles. Anything in brackets is a tag, anything not in brackets is a comment. That's simple. So this is literally what it's going to do, and then what the tag is and what it's set to. Key and value pairs. Intro on, windowed yes, X and Y coordinates. If these things look familiar, there's a reason. It's because down here, X and Y, 8025 cursive, X and Y, 80 by 25, and our font, which is curses, is not actually displayed here. Full screen X and Y, full font, same thing. The same settings that you have access to through the GUI here, you also have access to in the init files. Now, normally, I wouldn't mess with them in the init files unless you know what you're doing. And the options in the GUI are generally user-friendly and fairly hard to screw yourself on. You just need to know which of them are world settings and which of them are uh, which one are pertinent to which time you've run the game. So some of them you can flip on any given game session, and some of them actually impact your world. In particular, on the options list, aquifers no affects your world. If you generate your world with no aquifers and then you turn this on later, your existing world isn't affected. There are still no aquifers. If you have it on and you turn it off, your world doesn't suddenly lose aquifers. It's not how that works. So in order to make this work, my suggestion is figure out what settings on this front page you want normally and leave them there unless you have a reason to change them. We've already talked about temperature can be turned off, entomb pets, artifacts, weather, cave-ins. These things can be disabled later if you must, but I wouldn't. All of them are available in the init files, and there's a large number of options well beyond what's covered in the GUI because the GUI is assumed that you're a new user and you're unfamiliar with these. I won't cover the details in most of this tonight. We can maybe schedule one of the sessions along the way where I'll kind of dig into these in more detail, but they're fairly user friendly if you go through them. They kind of explain to you what they're doing. So, announcements. The announcements description right up here at the top tells you what the announcements will do. And some of this is very minorly spoilery, but not really. In particular, the things that we're going to be paying attention to here are DD, which tells us that it triggers during fortress mode, recenter, and pause. Now, in particular, what we're looking for are damp stone and wormstone, so we can actually search for them. Dig, cancel, damp, okay? So this is, I canceled a job, and I'll tell you about it in adventurer mode or dwarf mode. Now, notice how the difference in between these is we have warm mode set to pause and recenter, but damp mode does not pause or recenter. And what's really going on there is exactly what we set up in the GUI. In the advanced warnings or in the advanced settings here under announcements, damp stone is off, so it does not pause or recenter, and warm stone is on, so it does pause and recenter. These are the two that I normally mess with, and most of the rest of these I don't. But if you want to have all this stuff turned off or you want to affect your game in such a way as to cut down spam, you can disable the announcements from ever playing. A lot of this stuff impacts adventure mode more than dwarf mode. That's not to say there aren't some things that impact dwarf mode in here. There are. Any place you see DD is something that's going to affect dwarf mode. But as you scroll through this extensive list of announcements, a lot of them are adventure mode. They're specific to combat announcements and so forth. So, this is exactly what we wanted, and we could change it if we needed to. If I wanted to disable this manually for pausing and recentering, all I have to do is remove those from the tag, like that, and Wormstone will act the same way as Dampstone. We can put them back just as easily. We won't save our changes here because I don't really want to change that from what the GUI had. But that's tags and edits in a nutshell. Likewise, let's talk about why the Aquifer option doesn't impact the same way. Well, The settings for that are actually stored somewhere else, over in the data folder in your. Think for a moment here. Duh. Oh, I've done forgotten. That's terrible. Good lord. Where's my raw folder at? Oh, there it is. Duh. I'm in the data folder. Silly Matt. I'm thinking where my raws were. Okay. Raws are the text files that correspond to your objects and things in your world. Okay. So in particular, we're going to look at the objects folder. Now, this is everything. And when I say everything, I mean Dwarf Fortress is one of the most moddable games you've ever played, bar none. Simply put, you can modify everything in Dwarf Fortress right down to the body plan for your dwarves. If you want your dwarves to be born with 4 hands and 2 legs, you can make it so. Your dwarves will be ant people, and they will like it. All of that stuff is changeable. What foods, what plants, what animals, how they're built, what they're made, whether your spiders are poisonous, whether there are aquifers, what kinds of stone there are, what kinds of ore there are, what kinds of reactions you use with the ore to make it into ingots, what ingots you use to make into armor, what armor qualities, what material qualities your armor has. Is leather better than steel? Is steel better than leather? Is iron better than both of them? You can control all of that. It is all completely flexible. All of it is stored in the raws, and the depth of the raws is something we probably won't get into at all, even in the 30 days. There's a lot of data in here, and I mean a lot of data. Everything in the game that's represented is represented in one of these files. Now, generally speaking, they're fairly obvious and self explanatory, but there's a few we're going to focus on in particular. The organic stone, layer, and mineral settings here, as well as inorganic metal, inorganic other, and inorganic stone gem. Now, normally, the ones that we're really going to care about are going to be these here. These are all the inorganic soil materials in the game. Now, normally, this is what they look like for us. So they are objects that are inorganic, and this is a particular type of inorganic that happens to be called clay. It's a soil, yada, 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 on and on. You'll notice that this tells you can make it into earthenware, which tells you that you can make pottery from your clay and so forth. When I said everything is included in here, I mean just about everything you can touch is represented here. Now notice that this describes it as a soil. Now this is actually important because, let me close that for a second. We'll turn aquifers on for a moment. And when aquifers are on, there's a tag on these things that tells them whether they're an aquifer capable material or not. So these soils can have aquifers in them, meaning that aquifers are enabled for this. If you want to disable aquifers for a particular soil type for some reason, you could disable it for a particular soil type and leave it on for everything else in the world. So if you knew that your site had a particular soil type and you wanted to have aquifers in the world generally, but you maybe didn't want to mess with them on this Embark, there are ways to get there, but it's a little bit iffy afterward. The raws are backed up with your saves, so in addition to a generic set that affects all your world gens, there's effectively a copy of these that's saved with each world. That allows each world to have its own world settings at the object level, and for you to modify that in your object or in your world on the fly. Fair warning, editing your raws in your save games is a at your own risk sort of thing. Your game could be completely borked. Be very careful about what you're doing, know what you're doing before you do it, be cautious. Normally, since we turn aquifers off, I'll just disable it in the GUI, but you can use a find and replace to replace the square brackets with angle brackets, and that will have the same effect. Remember, in Dwarf Fortress init files, anything that isn't in square brackets is a comment. And as always, when editing files for a setup of any program, always make backups. Whew! So, on this whirlwind tour, we've covered the entire GUI, we've run through the init files, and we haven't even started the fucking game yet. It's 40 minutes into the broadcast. This will not stand. Now, the Lazy Noob Pack is nice because it reminds me that I'm an old fogey and I forgot I actually started these things before I started the broadcast, and they've been running down here all the time, so we don't really want to run them again, and we'll just turn them all off, and they're already down here, so you can all laugh at me now. So before we really get underway, I've had sound turned off this entire time because I've been talking pretty much non-stop, and that's going to get hard to sustain for 33 days, so we're not going to try. So what I need from you guys out there in Streamland is to let me know if the sound here is a little out of kilter with the voice. If this is too loud, let me know and we'll kind of get this dialed in a little bit before we get underway. Let me know how this is doing for you guys. Too loud? Okay. Yeah, I can kick it up a little bit. Is that better? Yeah, see the problem is if I turn it down if I don't turn it down far enough, you guys have trouble hearing me over the audio. A professional sound mixer I am not. All right. So, since we've got this running, let's start the game. God damn it did it again. Okay, so Dwarf Fortress will come up and it'll ask you. Actually, I need to bounce out of here for a second now that I'm thinking about it because we killed a save file, but we didn't actually restart Dwarf Fortress. Gotta get that intro video. Crucial. Crucial. For those of you not familiar, this is Dwarven life. Guy mining. Soldiers fighting. And then you mine adamantine, your pick goes missing, and you get your face burned off by a demon. Welcome to Dwarf Fortress. Okay, so, as normal, we're going to create a world. Now, for those of you who are new players and don't want to go through all the headache of figuring out what kind of world you want, and you just want to get started with the game, you can go into Create New World, and I'll take a peek at it, but we won't be going this way ourselves. This allows you to set your parameters within some very general rules, and then fire it up and let it go with a minimum amount of input. This allows you to set things kind of generally how you like them, but if you want to get a little more hands-on, the advanced parameters have significantly larger number of options, and that's where we're going to go tonight. There isn't anything special about a world you get one way or the other that you couldn't theoretically get from the other, but it's impossible to control the setting for your seeds in the intro world setting, so you'd have to run millions of them until you got the right seeds to line up with your custom map. So what's all this then? Okay, so what we're looking at here are world gen settings, and there's a collection of these. Large island, large region, medium region. And the general thrust here is this is the size of the world, not the world in which you play on a fortress mode, but the size of the world in which your fortress exists. And this is in world gen tiles, which are represented by many on your map tiles. Now, you're not going to want to necessarily run the giantest region you can ever run. You can, I have, you certainly can. But the bigger the region, the more stuff in the region, the more stuff, the slower it goes. The slower it goes, the more problematic it gets later. If you use too big a region right out of the gate, it starts to slow down early, and it can be problematic for you later on down the road. Additionally, as you accumulate fortresses in the same world, the amount of background stuff you have to deal with also accumulates. In addition to your fortresses accumulating crap, so are all the other dwarven hillock fortresses, and the elves and the goblins and the kobolds are all stealing all your shit. So it's all ending up in the world. Stuff is being created, but very rarely being destroyed. All that stuff has to be tracked. That's Dwarf Fortress in a nutshell. So the more stuff, the slower we run. So tonight, at least, we're not going to even go medium. We're going to go down here to this section marked small. Now, I have a fairly decent rig, but it is by no means an overclocked single-core monstrosity that I've built specifically for running Dwarf Fortress. We'll get decent frames out of this. We'll get effective Uh, we'll get effective forts, but we won't necessarily be able to build the biggest forts, and we won't necessarily have to be able to build forts that'll run for 1,000 years without running through frame rate death. So, we'll start with small region, and you could just hit enter and it will immediately begin creating based on the parameters that that has. So let me go down here and I'm going to actually delete this one I was tinkering around with the other night because I don't really care. It's just something I was messing with. We'll delete this guy too. So out of the box, these are the only ones you would have. I'm going to take the small region settings. I'm going to copy them off to a new collection of settings. It's also called small region because that's what it was called originally. We'll retitle that so that it doesn't get confused with the existing one. And now let's save those world gen settings. Now keep in mind, we haven't actually changed anything yet. So a world generated with custom small is exactly the same as one generated with a small region right now. To fix that, we're going to go into edit and we get to set all of these things. Now, this is going to be involved just like the init settings were. And those of you who are looking for gameplay probably ought to take a hike because I'm going to be at this for another 15 minutes or so while I run through all the different settings you're going to tinker with in World Gen, what they mean and how you tinker them to get the world you want. Those of you who are now quoting the Monty Python "Get on with it" video at me can just bite it. Seeds. For those of you who are unfamiliar with procedurally generated randomized worlds, seeds are the function that allows you to get the same world more than once in a row. If you want to be able to share your world to somebody else without actually having to send them the save file, you want to be able to have them generate the same world that you generated, that's what seeds are for. If you set a seed and you tell it to use that seed, you will get the same pieces of that functionality every time, assuming you don't change additional settings beyond that. So if they set up the same world gen settings you have, they will create the same world you do. That is to say, tonight, when I'm done, I can copy the world gen settings that we used for this world, copy them off, paste them out there on Reddit, and anybody who comes along can copy my world gen settings, paste them into their copy of Dwarf Fortress, and immediately generate the same world that I created out of the box, embark on the same fortress location I did, and be playing along with me as though they were riding along on my computer. That's handy and nice and kind of fun. So let's talk about this. So let's go ahead and we'll set these to use seeds, and just for something so that we know what this is, we're going to use day 1 as our seed text. Now, each of these is separate. If you don't use this seed at the top, you're going to get a different world structure. That means to say your world's going to look different. But to the extent that it's possible, your history, naming conventions, and creatures in the world will tend to be the same because you told it to use those seeds and didn't tell it to switch off. Random is exactly what you'd use. Seed is exactly what you'd expect. If you tell it to use a seed, you don't have one, it will randomize it for you. If you tell it to use or don't use a seed, or if you don't tell it to use a seed and you do put the seed description in, it'll still randomize it for you. So make sure you set both of them if you plan to have a repeatable event. Embark points. For those of you who are truly new players or who are looking to tinker around with fortress starts or mess with a mega project right out of the gate, setting the embark points changes the amount of stuff you can bring with you. So if you want to be able to bring, say, 3,000 gold bars right out of the gate, gold bars are expensive. You'll need a lot of embark points for that. Now, realistically, on a normal game, you wouldn't need 3,000 gold bars. There's no point to having that kind of fortress wealth on day 1. But maybe you wanted to practice with trading and you've got invasions turned off. Well, setting your embark points allows you to bring a lot more stuff in your wagon if you want. We won't mess with it because we're going to use a lot of the default settings. End year. This one is how long your world will run in World Gen if it doesn't hit any of the stopping conditions. So by default, if it doesn't hit any of these things that make it stop World Gen, it'll run out to this year. 1,000 years is a lot of time. If you're running, especially if you're running a big region, the longer World Gen runs, the slower it gets. So typically, I won't run much beyond about 200 years. Now, in a smaller region or a smaller pocket region, I can run a lot longer than that. I could run hundreds of years if it wouldn't stop it. I could run it until it was the age of death and it was impossible to play, because World Gen in smaller regions runs like lightning. But the longer history runs, the more events there are, and Dwarf Fortress tracks everything by default. Everything it tracks is one more thing it keeps track of, and all of those things add up. So don't run your fortress out too many years unless you are willing to run the risk that things are running a little slower than otherwise. At the same time, stopping this too early can lock you out of certain kinds of content. Certain things like necromancers and vampires, werewolves, kind of take a little bit of time to get going. So, if you want to have an ample selection of sites to embark on where there's a necromancer fortress somewhere nearby, you got to give the necromancers time to grow up, decide they don't like their civilization, wander off somewhere and find the secrets of life and death, wander off somewhere else and build a tower, raise a zombie army, get slaughtered by your adventurers, and so forth. If you don't run the world long enough, those necromancers never have time to do all those things, and your world just won't have necromancers. Likewise, certain other types of issues can be uh, problematic in the sense that they either won't have occurred or not enough of them will have occurred if you end this too soon. So I normally don't end it right out of the gate. I like to let at least 100 years of history run just to give history something to look back on. As a minor issue, if you stop history very early, like say on the year one, your engravers don't have any history to engrave. So when they start engraving events from your world's history, they don't have anything in the pile. So you might get stuff from World Gen history, or you might just get lots and lots of circles and trees, because that's the only thing that's interesting. They're literally living the mythological history of your world at that point. If you run 100 years in, you'll get a decent collection of things to experiment with and do. And for new players, 100 years is a good place to start. Running it longer doesn't make your world easier, running it less doesn't make your world harder. It's important to know how that's going to impact your world in a much more organic sense. So, population cap after civilization creation. That's how high you want your population of your civ to be capped during creation. This keeps civs from overrunning all the others because they were first on the block. Site cap after civ creation. This is after we've created the civs, how many different cities can a site have? Unless you're running a lot of history, this probably isn't going to impact you. Percentage beasts dead to check for stoppage. This actually needs a little bit of explanation because you've had no exposure to any of the terms in this description before you run into it. In the world are various things that the game refers to as mega beasts, dragons, rocks, really, really big monsters of mythology, bronze colossi, and titans. If a certain number of these, in this case 80% of them, die during World Gen stops because it doesn't want to run them all out of existence. If you don't care, you could disable this, and then it is possible to have a world where all the Titans are dead before you start playing. If you want it to stop earlier because you want to guarantee that there's a larger collection of Titans around, you can turn this down to potentially 0, in which case it will immediately stop your fortress from world jetting because they're always all alive. So, here to begin checking for Mega Beast percentage goes hand in hand with the percentage of beast to check. We don't start checking for that until the year 100, and then we don't stop until we hit 80% dead. So if you set this to 10,000, we don't check for the first Mega Beast death condition until 10,000 years have gone by. Your world gen probably freezes up before you actually hit that condition, so it's not really useful. If you want to get rid of mega beasts or have certain civilization features try to develop, like if you want to try and shoot for one of the special ages where a certain number of titans are alive or a certain number of civilizations are alive, having your mega beasts having an idea of how your mega beasts are going to behave in the world matters. During World Gen, mega beasts will lay waste to civilizations, crush their cities, hoard their gold, that kind of stuff. If they do it to all of a civilization, it's possible for them to wipe out a civilization, or for a civilization to get one up on the beast and kill it. At which point, either the civilization or the beast doesn't exist. It's up to you whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but generally speaking, if you don't have civilizations, you don't have much of a world to play in. Culling unimportant historical figures. This is all the little nobodies whose sole purpose in creation was to grow up and not do much of anything. They became a drunk, or they didn't get married, and they didn't produce any kids, and they went nowhere. They're dead ends. We just trim them right off the tree. If you want to see everything, leave this off. If you want to have your world be a little more compact, neat, and tidy, turn it on. It's not really a bad thing one way or the other. It simplifies your world gen history somewhat. Revealing all important historical events allows us to go into World Gen and start up Legends mode and see everything that's going on in our world immediately in Legends mode. If you turn this off, your events are kind of as you discover them or as you learn about them, which is kind of neat, I suppose, but not really for me. I want to have my history actually available. My dwarves know stuff beyond what I do, and I want to share in that knowledge. And those are kind of the general basic settings. After that, we get funky. What do I mean by funky? I mean we get to set all kinds of numbers that do all kinds of things for all kinds of worlds. And it gets, if you thought the stuff before this was complicated, wait till we get a load of elevation and rainfall. So, what does all this mean? How does this impact your fort? What the fuck does a rainfall variance do? It pretty much does exactly what it says. If you hop out on the Dwarf Fortress wiki and you search around for a while, you're going to come across a table that lists all the biomes in the game. Rainfall, drainage, elevation, and temperature are how the game knows whether a particular biome is a tundra or a tropical rainforest. And so if you want to encourage certain types of terrain, these are the kinds of settings you're going to get to mess with. In particular, we're not going to mess with them too much, but there's a few of these that you need to know what messing with them will do. So let's discuss that. Elevation. Maximum elevation 400 is important. If you reduce this, you get no mountain peaks. Mountain peaks are only declared when elevation hits 400. So if you want to have a mountain peak, you got to have enough elevation allowance. Normally, I wouldn't mess with this. Minimum, though, I do turn up a little bit, usually at about 30. Anything below, I think it's 100, is actually considered underwater. So, oops, I just paged down all over myself there. Don't, gotta go back up here. So, oops, that's volcanism, not the one we want. Ah! Keystrokes, how do they work? So we hit enter here and we set S for 30 like I was trying to do a minute ago, and presto. What this effectively does for our world is it narrows our oceans a little bit. We'll get a little more land. You don't want to normally eliminate all water completely. I mean, I like to have oceans occasionally, and if you want to disable them, there are other ways to go about it. But this allows you to kind of shave it off a little bit on the lower edge. The reality is that on these lowest elevations, you're not dealing with them anyway. So, the variances determine how much elevation is allowed to vary from point to point. That is to say, how wildly your elevation can change. If you want the Marianas Trench sitting right next to Mount Everest, you need to have enough variance to allow the elevation to swing that far. Likewise, if you want your deserts and tundras directly adjacent to your tropical rainforests, you've got to have enough variation in the other parameters to allow that terrain to flex that far. Normally, I wouldn't mess with these. The amount of variance is literally the amount of change allowed from tile to tile. So, for example, if we were at elevation 30 and we moved to the next tile over, the XY variance is how it's allowed to vary whether we move up, down, left, or right on the world map. And this is the amount, the 202, is the amount we're allowed to change when we make that move. So X variance versus Y variance is how much you're allowed to vary as you go east-west versus north-south on your world map. Normally, I wouldn't mess with these, but if you want to have the really wild and varied terrain, set this as wide as possible to allow for maximum variance possibilities. Rainfall works just like you'd imagine. If you have zero rainfall, you have zero rainfall. Now, the reality is, at least in Earth-like conditions, there is no place on Earth that never receives any rainfall ever. There's always some rain somewhere at some point at some time. Precipitation falls everywhere. So I normally turn that up to 1. If you set it too high, you can eliminate deserts, for example, because you don't have deserts if it rains too much. That's what rainfall does. So if you're curious about the specific impact, the articles on biomes and surroundings will be of importance to us here. In particular, surroundings deal with good, evil, and neutral, and biome is going to deal with what types of terrain everything is. Those of you asking me what drainage does out there in chat, don't worry, your time is coming. This chart tells you how these things interact. Rainfall works just like you'd imagine. Drainage works offset with that. So, based on our rainfall settings and our elevation settings, it'll tell you here anything elevation comes first. Anything below 100 is an ocean. So, my oceans are smaller by definition because I simply don't allow the deepest terrain of oceans to exist. Any terrain from 300 to 400 is a mountain, and 400 is a mountain peak in particular, which is like a terrain feature. If you don't have 400s, you don't have mountain peaks, even though you can still have mountains. If you don't have terrain above 300, you don't even have mountains, which means you won't have dwarves normally. You will normally want dwarves because by default, dwarves are the only playable civilization. So if you plan to play in fortress mode, you gotta have enough elevation to have mountains. All other biomes lie between those two extremes from top to bottom. It doesn't matter how high they are, how low they are. After they fall into the mid-range on elevation, all that matters is elevation or is rainfall and drainage. You can have cold swamps, you can have hot swamps. It doesn't matter. All that matters is those two things. Now, what you get is going to be determined by the intersection of how much drainage and how much rainfall you have. What box you fall into is the type of terrain you have. So, if I have low rainfall, I'm going to tend to get sand deserts, rocky wastelands, and badlands. Whether this is flat or hilly, doesn't matter. Okay? High drainage is hilly, the water runs off. Low drainage is flat, the water stays put. Now, this impacts a few other things as well, in addition to rainfall and drainage. So, in addition to your biome. We'll get to that in just a second. Typically, I like forested terrain, which means I tend to be on the higher end of the rainfall spectrum. And I prefer marsh swamp to shrubland broadleafs. Don't ask me why. I'm not sure. It's not a particularly dwarven terrain by any stretch of the imagination. But that's what I like. So if I wanted to bias my world that way, I want to try and generate more land that has rainfall in this zone and has drainage in this zone in order to generate these two types of biomes. And you can manipulate your world however you like to encourage whatever biomes you prefer to play in any given world, or let it go along however you like. Now, in addition to biomes, which we're covering kind of indirectly through our elevation and temperature and all that, there's also good and evil, which we'll get into in a second. So, what does all this mean? Well, normally, like I said, for realism's sake, every place in my world gets at least some rainfall every year. There's no place on Earth that doesn't get rainfall ever. Even if it takes 100 years to get some, there's some rainfall. Likewise, you could turn drainage up the same way if you like. There's no such thing as impervious. Well, that's not entirely true. Certain obsidian type rock formations don't have any drainage, so a flat lava field, for example, doesn't drain really. It's just a bowl. If it doesn't have an outlet for the water will sit there until it evaporates. So those I leave as is. Temperature. This isn't really Celsius or Fahrenheit, really. It's kind of a dwarven temperature scale. If you want to have a warmer world, I'd turn the minimum up a little bit, but I wouldn't get crazy. Likewise, if you want a hotter world overall, you could turn the maximum up, but I definitely wouldn't get crazy with the maximum. Set the maximum too high, and if it hasn't been changed, your dwarves can melt. Worlds that are too hot are no fun to play in. Worlds that are too hot will have a hard time getting tundra and other icy type biomes. Temperature kind of overrules whether something is tundra or not after it's been determined. So if you generated a swamp, but it happens to be in a frozen tundra area, it's not going to be a swamp, it's going to be a tundra. So there's elevation, rainfall, temperature, and drainage. And normally, I don't mess with any of them except the ones that I've already tweaked and the way I've already tweaked them. Volcanism. This one I especially don't tweak, and there's a reason. Zero volcanism is necessary for flux stone to be generated. This is the sedimentary rock that exists in the world. So this is stuff like uh, calcium carbonate bearing rocks, limestone, and the like. If you don't have that, there's no flux stone in your world, and that makes it very difficult to generate steel. Like really, really hard if those stones don't exist at all. Similarly, 100% volcanism is required for any volcanoes to exist. So if I want to be able to embark on a volcano for whatever reason, I need to have tiles that are allowed to be volcanoes, and that requires 100 volcanism. So, variance. Those of you who heard my explanation on variance earlier kind of are now wondering, why is the variance set to 101 when the maximum variance here is really only 100, 0 to 100, right? And the answer is, it's technically not. 1 to 99 is like 98. 0 to 99 is 99 plus 1. No, I'm kidding. It's not. It's got nothing to do with that. What it is you're saying, I want this to vary at the maximum. From 0 to 100, right adjacent to each other, I don't care. I want my sedimentary limestone to be right next to my extrusive igneous rock. I don't care that it makes no geological sense whatsoever. I want it. That's okay. Dwarf Fortress really doesn't care. Savagery. Okay. In addition to good and evil, and terrains and biome, savagery. Those of you who like giant animals, who want animal men, and who want ferocious biomes, you're going to want to have a savage terrain. Likewise, if you want walking undead, you're going to want evil. If you want unicorns and fairies, you're going to want good. And everything else kind of falls in the middle in neutral. Well, what does all that mean? Okay, there's three basic types of terrain: good, neutral, and evil. And for new players, neutral is probably the safest. Good is usually okay, but good also can have unicorns, and unicorns aren't necessarily your friends. So, good is usually a safe option, and neutral is a safe option. Evil is something as a new player I would avoid out of the gate. Evil terrain has things like your butchery byproducts coming back to life to kill your dwarves with a sense of hatred and malice that's only be experienced by shells from your discarded muscles coming back to life and trying to pinch all your dwarves to death. And don't laugh, they can. Remember, the undead never get tired. Your dwarves eventually will. So, at least out of the gate, I'd avoid evil terrain entirely. And if you're really a new player and you're wanting a softer landing, go for something in the serene or calm categories. Anything on the low end of savage tends to have a lower, let's call it a wildlife difficulty, if you will. And good and neutral terrain by far are a wild step different from evil. Anything in the evil terrain is new player unfriendly. Anything in the savage end of the spectrum is unfriendly-er, but not as unfriendly as evil. And anything at the far left and upper ends up here is going to be new player friendly-er. Keep in mind, this is Dwarf Fortress. There's no such thing as a completely safe zone. If you're wanting a safe area, you're going to have to manipulate your raws, you're going to have to manipulate your invasions. Just setting up to encourage calm, neutral, and serene good environments to flourish is not going to eliminate aggressive wildlife or invasions. It doesn't work that way. What it will do is control how often those things appear in your world. To wit, let's get down here to savagery. Now, I like to turn savagery up a little, but not too much. And the reason I turned it up a little is to encourage the world gen to produce more of the other types of savagery. So even my minimal savagery areas tend to be on the high end of low savagery. If you think of savagery like a continuum from 0 to 100, as it is for all of these settings above, a savagery of, I want to say, these are divided up into roughly 30% ranges, a savagery of up to, say, 32 is low savagery, which is necessary for some civilizations to exist. Likewise, if I want to reduce the amount of that, or rather scale it so that even the low savagery areas are at least a little savage, you can up the minimum so that the only low savageries in my area occur between savagery 10 and 32 instead of 0 to 32. This increases things a little bit, but it's not a wild change. It's not an enormous change. If you set your minimum savagery too high, certain civilizations can't exist outside in savage areas by default, and you may end up with no playable civilization. If you want to challenge yourself, set up for an evil terrain, set up for a high savagery, and then hold on to your butt. Mesh sizes and weighted ranges. All of this next session, elevation, rain, drainage, savagery, all that stuff we talked about above, it all comes back again. And those of you who are following along are going, what the fuck? We just did this shit. Yeah, you did. So now we need to take a moment and talk about, say, how Dwarf Fortress generates its world. Imagine a big sheet of graph paper. Okay? That's a blank Dwarf Fortress world. If you drew a giant box on that graph paper, that would be the size of your world. Now, mesh size is how big the collections of boxes are between corner points on the mesh. What the fuck is a mesh? Well, say your world is 64 by 64 and your mesh size is 2 by 2. What you're saying is every 2 squares I want to draw a point on the grid. So if you are looking at your graph paper and you're putting your points on the intersections of those lines, mesh size is how many squares are contained in each one of the boxes formed by you putting points on the grid. Smaller mesh size means smaller, or it means more squares more often, more varied terrain. Larger mesh size means fewer squares, fewer points, flatter, less diverse terrain. Neither of these is better or worse. It's just a question of how varied you want your world to look. If you want your world to look like a real patchwork randomized pile of scramble, turning the mesh size up and increasing the things that increase the variety of your world will encourage those sorts of things to occur. Now, normally I would use a small mesh size. I would use a small mesh size for all of these. The weighted ranges then go inside that. So again, imagine our sheet of graph paper, and we're putting our points on the map every 2 squares, vertically and horizontally. Every 2 by 2 spot, we put a point. Now, Dwarf Fortress then sets the elevation, rainfall, drainage, temperature, savagery at each of those points. So you have, if you will, a rectangular grid of points. And then it interpolates between each of those points. So if you have a high savagery area next to a low or a high savagery point adjacent to a low savagery point, the area between those 2 points is a sliding average from those 2 maximums. So if you looked at it as a line on a graph, savagery would start at the high point and it would slowly decrease until you got to the low point. And if you looked at it on the map, the decrease would literally map to the space between those 2 points. High at the point where it was highest, low at the point where it was lowest, and a gradation between the two. And that's World Gen in a nutshell. In order to encourage Dwarf Fortress to generate the types of terrain I like, I find that there's generally going to be 3 ranges of terrain I care about. So let's go back to our biomes for a second. Get rid of these tabs I don't need anymore. Generally speaking, if I zoom in on this bad boy a little bit, those of you squinting from the back row can now take a sigh of deep breath of relief here. You'll notice that there's a division at 65 and a division at 32. Okay? And these divisions come up over and over again, although it's not as prevalent down here. The 65 division doesn't have any real lines going across. If you wanted to think of this in 3 branches, low, medium, and high, 32, 65, 100 are the breakpoints for low, medium, and high. Everything 32 and below is low, everything 65 up to that is medium, and everything beyond 65 is high. Typically, I care about stuff in the lowest of the low ranges, the middlest of the middle ranges, and the upperest of the upper ranges. That tends to cut out on my conifer forest. It tends to cut out on hilly savannas. It tends to cut out on flat savannas. I tend to encourage deserts, grasslands, rocky wastelands, and badlands, although less of the grasslands and more of those lowest ones, shrublands and marshes, swamps, and broadleaf forests. This encourages the 3 broad ranges of terrain that I like and cuts out on a lot of the, let's call it, transition area between them. It won't eliminate it entirely. Remember, Dwarf Fortress is doing this on an interpolation, and it's it's weighting these points based on what I select. So when I set them, to bring this all home, if I set this to say 10, 1, 10, and for the sake of amusement, 5, I'm going to change it in a minute. What I'm really saying is I want 10 times as much of this terrain as I do of this terrain based on that range. Now, for elevation, that matters because what I'm basically saying, if I want the 80 to 100, is this is mountains, this is mid range kind of hillock territory, and this is oceans. And so you can minimize the amount of beachfront land. You're going to have stuff go straight from the oceans, straight into the mid range, straight into the high range if you weight it this way. There'll still be some transition, but it'll be minimized. So you'll get these large swaths of terrain that fit into each of those categories with as little crossover as possible. So, how would I set all of these? Well, typically speaking, I don't really want all that much low elevation. Low elevation is your the lowest 20% range. Remember, we're going from 0 to 400 is the bottom 80. So if you think of this as being a division of the 400 units in the elevation, each one of these is 80 units per range, and the lowest 80 is literally ocean. And I really don't give a rat's flying butt about ocean because you can't build on it. Beyond that, I want to have low elevation and some mid-range elevation and some high elevation. And I don't really necessarily care about the stuff directly adjacent to the mountains. I care about, is there some grassland for the humans and forest for the elves, and is there mountains for the dwarves? And we're done. The stuff in the middle is stuff that people settle when they feel like it, but it's not stuff that they necessarily require for their civilization to get off the ground. And then we go down to each range and below. And likewise for the rain. Remember, we covered this biome thing where I want to encourage deserts and I want to encourage forests, and I don't really care so much about that middle transition grasslandy kind of area. So we're going to set the weighted ranges accordingly. I want 10 times as much desert and badlands as I do for that grasslandy hilly area. And then I want to have I want to have some shrubland for savannas and plains kind of areas. And then I want to have plenty of swamps and marshes and forests for the dwarf or for the elves and possibly for us if we're new players. So these weighted ranges broadened that way will give us minimum transitions between these areas that we're emphasizing. Likewise, we're going to go down here to drainage mesh, and on this one, it's about caring about the extremes. I care about high drainage, and I care about mid drainage, and I care about low drainage, but I don't care so much about the transitions. I want the transitions over with because what I care about are the terrains at those extremes. Savagery. So this is how much good neutral, or excuse me, how much low savagery, mid savagery, and high savagery terrain you want. If you leave these all at the defaults, you don't need a mesh size. So it's up to you whether you want to change them or not. You'll need to have some low savagery areas in order to have certain races actually exist, so don't get rid of it completely. But I, generally speaking, like to emphasize a combination of the low and the high, and I don't really care as much about whether it falls in the middle. And the reason is because whether it's this is a 100 range, so on savagery from 0 to 100. So you're saying from 0 to 20, I want to have lots of this. My low savagery areas are fairly low. Keep in mind, my range is squeezed a little bit, so low for me is still above 10 because I have a minimum in place here. My low is running from something like low to whatever 20% of 90 is. Go ahead, math fiends, go nuts. Likewise, I don't care about these middle ranges exactly how much there is. There's going to be some, and beyond that, I don't care. High savagery is necessary if we want to be able to embark in untamed wilderness, for example. We'll have to have some, and I want to encourage it to be there, so I've added a little more. Temperature mesh, again, we'll use the small mesh size, and again, I really only care so much about the extremes, and in this case, we're going to leave the low temperature. In this case, I don't really even care about the extremes. Temperature is for your tundras. So this is how big do you want your polar areas and your equatorial areas to be? If you want high temperature rainforests near the equator, you'll need to encourage that. If you want to have a hotter world or a colder world, your elevation or your mesh size here will allow you to affect that more specifically than just temperature overall. Uh, Allowing these to encouraging these ranges will effectively map to the points on the map. So if you wanted to have a larger amount of tundra, for example, you could lower the minimum temperature, but too low and dwarves start freezing to death every time they walk outside, whether they're dressed for it or not. Instead of doing that, what you can do is come in here and say, well, I want to have the mesh be, 2 by 2, and I want to have lots more tundra, so I'll set the low temperature range to 10, and we want to have lots of equatorial, rainforest, so we'll have a high range of 10, and you'll get lots of tundra and lots of equatorial hot zones, and the temperature transitions will be fairly minimized. Now, realistically, I want kind of a sort of ish realistic temperature gradation in my world. Cold stuff at the poles, hot stuff in the middle, and a fairly smooth one-to-one gradation along the way. If you want to encourage hot or cold, here's where you go. Volcanism mesh size. If we want to be able to have flux next to our volcanoes as much as possible, the variance allows our minimum and maximum changes, but this sets how we have the points. In particular, I want lots and lots of flux stone, and I want lots and lots of volcanism, and then I care about having some of the middle metamorphic rocks. For those of you who are geology nuts or who have played Dwarf Fortress Bahome, before, you're going to want to set up for those. I won't go in too much detail about how this is affecting our geology, but the gist is this is creating a lot more sites where we can find limestone and flux type stones, a lot more sites where we can find volcano type terrain or embark on a volcano, and we're going to get both of them in the same world by adjusting how often these 2 points appear. And if we turn down the amount of transition terrain in between them, although you're still going to get some because, again, we're interpolating between these 2 points, you'll cut down on the amount of interpolation caused by having points that are generated at those medium areas. So your terrain will get much more varied, much more over a much smaller scale. Smaller direction or smaller distance change, but still wide variety of volcanism or temperature, for example. Poles are if you want to have cold poles, whether it's north, south, both, one or the other, or neither. Uh, I kind of like north and south personally. That gives you cold terrain at both ends and warm terrain in the middle. And since we're doing a region with no oceans, that works for us. Mountain peaks are primarily just novel map features. If you want to have them on your map, great. If you set the minimum too high or if you set the maximum elevation too low, you won't have any of these and you can force your world not to generate successfully. If you tell it you have to have 10 mountain peaks, but then you disable elevations necessary for mountain peaks, your world's never going to get created because you've created an impossibility. You can't do that. Now, I don't really care too much about mountain peaks. I'll leave one in there because why not? But I don't really care about them at all. Partial and complete edge oceans are exactly what they sound like. This is how many of these things I must have on my map for it to be allowable. Normally, I don't care about oceans. I don't build on them. If you plan to build along an ocean, you want to deal with salt water for your dwarves, you want to deal with ocean fishing, oceanside fishing, turn these on. Partial edge oceans are oceans which are on the edge of your map but which do not contain the entire edge. Complete edge oceans are edges that run from the entire side. So, if we're talking about the west edge, a complete ocean runs north to south all the way. A partial edge ocean picks up somewhere in the middle and runs somewhere down the middle, and it might run all the way to one edge but not to both. If you're generating an island, your complete edge oceans is going to be 4. If you're generating a peninsula, your complete edge oceans is going to be 1 and your partials is going to be 2. So that you can get a north and a south that are partials and a complete ocean edge on the third edge and then land attached on the fourth. So how you want to set those is down to what kind of world map you want. If you're trying to generate Tolkien's Middle Earth map, you'll have to know where your coastlines are and how much ocean you have to make that work. Minimum volcano number. Now, I tend to set this a little higher, but don't get too crazy. If you set this too high, your world will get kicked off just like always. If I set this for 100 and I don't allow enough space for 100 volcanoes to be created, the world's never going to get created because there's not enough volcanoes to be acceptable. Turning it off completely means you don't have a minimum volcano number, which means your world will be acceptable even if you don't have volcanoes. You may not care. Turn it off if you like. Doesn't matter to me. But I like to have some volcanoes in case I prefer later to embark on one. Mineral scarcity. I saw the most fantastic graph for this the other day. Let's see if I can find it real fast. and it's out here on the wiki. And this tells you exactly what mineral scarcity does in a nice picture format. I love this. This is fantastic. My congratulations to whoever compiled this data and put this graph out here. I love you forever. Someone should have your kids, just not me. So, what does mineral scarcity do? Well, normally it's at 2,500, okay? Which out of the gate means that on average you're going to have about a million different ores, and that's units of ore, and approximately 50 different types of ore, give or take. As you turn scarcity down, the number of types and the amount of ore goes completely vertical at some point. You turn this all the way to zero, you probably don't even get enough layer stone anymore to build. It's just metal everywhere all the time because you've decided to embark on an iron asteroid, I guess. Realistically, you're not going to want it quite that low. If you need to do something where you need an extreme amount of metal, then yeah, I'll turn it down a lot. But generally speaking, even a small change from the vanilla is going to go vertical pretty quick. From from 2500 to 2000 is just this section on the graph. You're adding like 10 different types of ores, and you're probably adding 200,000 units of ore right off the bat with just that small move. From 2500 to 1000, you're going from somewhere around a million ores to somewhere around a million five. From 2.5 down to 5, suddenly you're up at, call it 3 million and a half ish or. Now, this is going to vary somewhat. That's the point of these X's. It follows this general line, but you can have worlds that have more types or fewer types, more stone or less stone. And for the same Embark region, you can get a slight variance on this. But overall, this is the log. This is the chart that is applying to your mineral scarcity. This is how it impacts you directly. Personally, I like to turn it down a little, but not wildly. And that encourages iron and similar metals to be produced. But if you get too far down, you'll start to crowd out flux stone, and you don't really want to go. And coal will start to get pushed out in favor of metals. You normally don't want to go too far down. But coal can be generated with wood, and metal has to be imported or mined. So there's a trade off if you're going to run a really long world. Maximum Mega Beast and Semi Mega Beast caves are kind of what you'd think. So Mega Beasts are the larger, and Semi Mega Beasts are things like Minotaurs rather than iron, or rather than bronze colossuses and dragons. Semi Mega Beasts aren't, I don't believe, checked in stoppage, and Mega Beasts are. So 80% stoppage means once we have a Mega Beast die in our world, it's going to stop because we have four, and we're going to drop to 75% if one of them dies. 3 Titans. These attack requirements determine how soon a Titan may arrive and attack your civilization. Titans normally wouldn't attack us before we have 80 people or 100,000 dwarf bucks worth of goodies that we've produced. Keep in mind, we're probably going to crank 100,000 dwarf bucks worth of goodies off in about the first 3 months of our fortress. So this isn't going to give us a lot of lead time in terms of attacks. The population requirement probably would, but this one certainly won't. Demon types, night trolls, boogeyman, vampires, werebeasts, secret types. All of these are various types of evil critter and other related similar things. Uh, Demon types are literally like if you ever paged through the old D&D monster manual for all the different uh, types of demon. That's basically what this is. 22 different demon types here means you've got 22 different wildly varying demons. Night trolls, similar. Boogeyman, similar. Vampire curses and werebeasts, and so on, same things. You can turn these off by setting them to 0, but realistically, I wouldn't bother. Setting them to 1 minimizes the amount of variation, so you might have werewolves, but you won't have were-hyenas. Or you might have were-hyenas, but not werewolves. Or you might have were-gerbils and neither of the above. If you set it for 100 on, say, werebeasts, every furry mammal known to man is probably going to have a were type attached to it. And there's a lot of furry animals out there. Likewise, if you want to think of these vampire curses as slightly different flavors of vampire, that's close, but in terms of gameplay effect, it doesn't have much impact. Similarly, boogeyman, night trolls, and demon types aren't likely to impact you if you're not in adventure mode on a regular basis. Regional disturbances and interactional disturbances. This is stuff like your I'm trying to think of what all this impacts, but the gist is these are regional areas of cloud type terrains that can affect your guys. Normally I wouldn't turn it off, but if you want your regions to have special types of effects, this is where it goes. Different types of evil cloud and evil rain. These can do things, all sorts of things, and I don't just mean they can rain blood. Evil clouds and evil rains can do things like turn your dwarves immediately and instantly into flesh-hungry thralls that immediately turn around and start seeking out the rest of your dwarves. If you embarked in evil terrain, evil clouds and evil rains are going to come up for you on a regular basis. And good luck to you, sir. You're going to need it. Generate divine materials is whether the angels and demons have their own particularly unique dwarven metal. So this is like, imagine, if you will, the artifacts of Tolkien's Silmarillion. The Silmarils aren't really made out of gems; they are more light made into solid objects. That's kind of what divine metals are. This is swords made out of law, and uh, maces made out of chaos, and breastplates made out of darkness, that kind of stuff. All of these metals have unique effects that make them incredibly useful as those metals, but you can't normally find them outside of their previously created shapes. You don't mine divine metals, you find stuff made out of them that was given to an angel somewhere along the line. This is like handing Gandalf a magical ring, if you will. Normally I'd leave these on, especially if you plan to play in adventure mode, because you can actually collect those items and use them for yourself if you're in adventure mode. Good and evil square counts in large subregions. If they don't have at least this minimum, they'll get bumped up. Turning this too high will require a certain number of squares to be in each of those regions. What the hell does all this mean? Okay. A subregion is a particular named region of the map, the Swamp of Forgetting, the Mountains of Terror, and so forth. Depending on the number of squares in that region, it's either a good or a large region, a small region, or somewhere in the middle in a medium region. If a region does not have at least this number of squares, the entire region will be made into that type at some point. So I want to have, according to this world gen setting, at least 127 squares that exist in large subregions as evil terrain. If there are no large evil, or if there are no large or large subregions large enough to have 127 uh, evil squares, then at least one of my large subregions will be completely evil. That's okay for me. That's how it impacts. Likewise, good works the same way, just for good instead of evil. So if you have these set too high, you'll end up with at least one subregion being completely good or completely evil, rather than having parts of it broken off. Minimum counts. This is what things start at and what they're required to be when they're finished. And this is based on regions and squares. Now, keep in mind, we've eliminated some of these terrains, like we don't have any oceans, so I don't want to have minimum ocean counts because there might not be any oceans and it would fail my world immediately. We've also turned down some of these others, so initial grassland, initial hills could be a problem for us, but I don't think so. I think we'll squeeze in along the way somewhere. And we've turned off the final region counts because we don't want to try and force regions into the types we want. As So a couple questions popped up about the monster types. Let me double back a second here. So folks asked, well, wouldn't the number of demon types impact Fortress mode because that's the number of types of hidden fun stuff at the bottom of the world? Yeah, kinda, but the reality is that demons are demons, and it really doesn't matter whether they're most of the time, whether they're made out of rock or made out of steel, they're still going to eat you. Now there are some exceptions. Demons made out of air or smoke or fire are usually really fragile and break easily. So if you get lucky with your demon types and you have a low number of counts, you could have demons that are incredible pushovers. Or you could go the other way and get demons that are made out of brass, and that would suck. So yeah, that impacts on your dwarf fortress mode fortress, but it's not going to impact you wildly. Demons are demons at the end of the day, and they have to be treated with respect, even if they're super fragile and made out of salt. Folks pointed out the number of or that having divine materials clutters up your menu, and it does. So you can turn it off, and you just won't see them. Since we're playing in fortress mode, the chances of this impacting on us at all are really slim. If at some point we're going to do an adventure mode world, we might want to turn that on for that world so that we have the opportunity to encounter those things. Ahem. So after we've gotten all these regions created, then Dwarf Fortress literally simulates erosion. No, I'm not kidding. I wish I was. It literally runs erosion cycles on your world. This will break down your high mountains. It will erode cliffs and so forth. Extreme cliffs are elevation 400 directly next to elevation 100. That's an extreme cliff. Anything that sharp is definitely in the extreme category. If you turn on the erosion, these will go away, at least to some extent. That's not to say you won't have cliffs, but the Mount Everest next to Marianas Trench stuff goes away, at least to some extent. It would be a slightly better interpolated gradation. Orographic precipitation and rain shadows. Those of you who live on the mountains in the real world and meet space know what this is, whether you think about it or not. Orographic precipitation and rain shadows are the effects of weather on mountains on weather and rain deposition in the world. In the real world, as in Dwarf Fortress when you turn this option on, rain is deposited typically on one side of the mountains. If you look at the Rocky Mountains in the United States, one side of them tends to be a lot wetter than the other side, which tends to be, well, drier and more desert-like. That's a rain shadow. As the clouds pass over from one side to the other, they tend to drop their water on one side of the mountain versus the other. That's a rain shadow. Normally I leave those on so we get some more realistic terrain, but if you're doing something particular, it could get in your way. For new players, it's probably not going to be something you care about. Maximum number of subregions. Unless you're trying to turn this down for some reason, I normally crank it all the way to the maximum. I don't want to limit or to turn a world off and kick it out the door just because it generated more subregions than I told it I wanted to allow. If I'm setting my terrain up to be varied, I want to allow the maximum amount of variation in my terrain. Now, subregions are those named regions. Remember I said they're like Mountains of Terror or the Swamp of Forgetting or whatever. This is the number of named regions you can have. So if you want lots and lots of named landscape features, as it were, turn this up. They'll get named. Turn it down and you'll get lots of areas that aren't named, or larger areas will get named and smaller areas won't. Caverns. There's an article on the wiki with a particularly useful graphic that shows you the differences here, but a few notes. First off, if you turn caverns off completely, that eliminates all sorts of underground farming. Don't do that. Leave at least one cavern layer. You only require one to have underground farming enabled. If you want to limit the amount of caves, turning it down to one basically dumps all the critters from all three cave levels into the one level. If you set it for two, that means the first level works like normal, but all the stuff that normally would have been in cave level 3 gets dumped into cave level 2 in addition to the stuff in cave level 2. So you're not eliminating anything unless you totally turn off the caves completely, but by reducing the cave number down, you're making the caves more dangerous. The excuse me, the higher elevation caves more dangerous, and elevation here is meant to mean Z level elevation closer to the surface rather than mountain elevation in terms of world Z level. So if you set this for 1, the cave you puncture into is just as dangerous as cave level 3 would be normally because it effectively is cave level 3 that you're puncturing. Normally I would not turn these off and I normally wouldn't turn them down, but if you're running on an older rig that may not have the power to run Dwarf Fortress with really deep worlds on big regions with lots of dwarves, turning down the number of caves and reducing the amount of spaces or the amount of tiles in a map will speed up your world somewhat. Openness and passage density go hand in hand. Dense, tight passages look like catacomb hallways, 1 square wide by 1 square, weaving like worm trails all the way through the rock. As openness gets larger, spaces in the hallways get larger. They look more like rooms and chambers rather than like worm trails. As passage density gets lower, the worm trails have more space between them. So if you want to have pockets of more open rooms with less worm trails, you'll need to turn your openness up and your density down. If you want to have tight, compact worm trail like tunnels on every cave, you'll want the density to be high and the openness to be low. And you can mess with those to your heart's content. And there's a wiki article out there talking about the differences. But generally speaking, I don't find messing with these a whole lot to be particularly useful. If you're going to be embarking your building into the caves and you want more terrain, you're just going to end up digging the terrain out. And if you don't want more terrain, you probably don't care whether it was there all along anyway. And remember, open spaces mean more pathfinding. More pathfinding means a slower game. So lots of caves with lots of open spaces means lots more spaces to pathfind when you have those caves accessible to your dwarves, which means more pathfinding, which means a slower run. Water minimum and water maximum need some talking about. Uh, Water minimum will impact you in fortress mode. If there's no water in any of your caves, you don't get cave crops, cave plants growing naturally. That's not to say you can't have underground cave crops, but you won't get them in the caves. You'll just get dry, empty caves. No cave moss at all. That could be a problem if you want to do underground farming because no cave moss is no underground farming. So generally speaking, I like to turn this up to 1. That means all of my caves have at least some water. If you want to have the option for dry caves, which is realistic, turn it off completely. Allow 0 because 0 is a dry cave. What this means is I will always have the option for underground farming, no matter what, in the caves on any site I embark. If this were 0 and I had 1 cavern layer allowed, then I couldn't farm underground on that area because there wouldn't be any water. I'd have to flood terrain in order to make underground farms. But natively, you couldn't do it. Now, I like having the option to farm, and I like having cave trees, so I like turning this on. If you don't like those things, you can set the maximum down lower and disable them completely. Magma layer and bottom layer, leave them on. There's no reason to disable them. If your frame rate is really, really, really hitting you, disabling them will work, but you're cutting out some of the late game fun if you do that. I won't go into too much detail, but the gist is leave them on unless you got a reason to turn them off. Z levels above and Z levels at bottom all go hand in hand. And if you think of the world like a stack of pancakes, what you're really looking at is how thick each pancake in the layer can be. Okay? Z levels above the ground is stuff above the ground in terms of sky. If you want to build a really tall tower, you'll need a larger number here. As it is by default, you only have 15 levels above the highest point on your fortress map to build in. So if you embark on a mountain right next to a valley in your same map, that's great because the mountain will give you 15 above the peak of the mountain as your highest point to build in. And if you build whatever it is you're trying to build in the valley, you'll have plenty of space above surface level to build in. However, if you plan on building a 30-story tall tower and you embark on a flat plain, you only have 15 levels by default above the ground. Your tower will get up to the highest level and have nowhere up left to go because the world simply isn't generated that tall. Keep that in mind if you like to build extensive above ground fortifications. Normally, I would turn this down or leave this as it is or turn it down. Realistically, I don't build towers that often, and more space means more room for the birds to move around in, which means more pathfinding, which we covered earlier. So I wouldn't turn it up. You might turn it down. Z levels above 1, above 2, and above 3 are all kind of the same thing. They are the Z levels above that cavern layer. So above layer 1 is the space between the surface and the first cave. And normally speaking, for a new player, I'd turn this up to about 15. This guarantees that you will have at least 15 levels of solid stone and soil between the surface and your first cave. That's plenty of room to build an enormous fortress in. Realistically, on each one of the other two, I also allow myself 5 levels each. This allows me something like a guard fortress between each cave level, or stockpiles specific to that cave, or something equally interesting. If I wanted to build my fortress in segments between the caves, or if I wanted to have certain industries located next to a particular cavern layer, I've got a few layers between the caves to play with. If this is set at 1, you could literally have one layer of stone between cave 2 and cave 3. That's great if you want your caverns to be connected, or if you don't need to build between them. It could be problematic if you want to build between them. Now, how you want to set those up depends on how much space you plan for your fortress to take and how vertically you intend for your fortress to exist. My typical fortress is fairly vertical. It's like a skyscraper underground. That means I need a large number of layers, or I have to be willing to puncture the caverns and wall them off so that I can continue down through them. Generally speaking, you can do that, but it's a pain in the ass if you don't have to. And if all you're wanting is to be able to build a large fortress, sometimes it's fun not to have to dick around with trying to avoid pathfinding issues and frame rate issues in the future. So, Z levels at bottom. And yeah, I'm skipping a couple, but there's a reason. I'm coming back. Don't touch this one. Leave it at 1. You can turn it up, but these are levels your dwarves are normally not ever going to build in or really even see. And the people who do use these Z levels need to have at least one if you've enabled the layer. So don't turn it off. Setting it larger doesn't help you. Don't turn it up. In fact, setting it larger can actually make things worse because the guys at the bottom eventually start pathfinding around at the bottom at some point. And when they do, there's a lot of them and a lot of space to pathfind in. Well, this sounds like we're repeating ourselves because we are. Z levels above layer 5 is the stuff above the hidden fun stuff at the bottom of the world. I wouldn't normally turn this up. If you do, there is a slight bonus in the sense that it can make the soda straws of fun candy material longer, but it also means lots and lots of useless layers you can't build in, so kind of a really mixed bag there. I normally don't need so much candy that I have to turn this setting up. Your mileage may vary, but normally for new players, I wouldn't mess with it. Z levels above layer 4 deserves special mention. This one is going to be a personal preference kind of setting. If you plan to build lots of stuff out of adamantine and candy, you want to have lots and lots and lots of it, turning this up will probably help you. Adamantine spires tend to intersect or rise up to the level of the bottom cave. That is to say, they rise up to or intersect with the bottom of cavern level 3. Z level 4 here, Z levels above layer 4 is the space you have between the bottom of cavern level 3 and the bottom, if you will, of the world, where the semi-molten rock and the hidden fun stuff starts. So, if you want to guarantee yourself lots and lots and lots of candy adamantine to make all those fancy weapons and armor that you've seen only in the books and the stories, turn this up. 15 levels will probably give you more candy than you're ever going to know what to do with. If you turn it up stupidly high, you can have lots and lots of candy. If your candy straws actually touch the caverns, this will force the straw to be at least that long. Making it larger encourages longer straws, but does not guarantee them. And for those of you wondering what the hell I'm talking about when I say straws, don't worry about it for now. Just suffice to say there's a really super duper resource at the bottom, and turning this up can get you more of it, but doesn't guarantee it. It also could get you all sorts of other fun stuff, so again, kind of a mixed bag. Natural cave size. So this is how big your caves can be vertically. 5 floors to 25 floors. If you set them too small, you won't get cave trees because they're too short. If you set it too tall, you've got a bunch of empty space for no good purpose. I wouldn't normally mess with it. Your mileage may vary. Mountain caves and non-mountain caves are those places where kobolds and semi-mega beasts live, and how many of them should be in the mountains versus not the mountains. Unless you have a reason to change this, I wouldn't mess with it. Make caves visible. I turn this on. I want to know if I'm trying to set up a fortress where a kobold civilization has already developed. That's not to say I wouldn't do that, although I never have. I probably wouldn't. But if I want to have the option, I need to know where those things are so I can put my fortress where I want it. Allow Embark init options to show tunnels no longer has any function. This used to be tunnels between places on the world map. I don't even think those things get generated anymore. As far as I know, this does nothing now. Number of civilizations. This is the number of elf, dwarf, human, and goblin and kobold civilizations in the world. Playable required is whether you want to have a civilization that is marked as playable in the init files to be turned on. For those of you who are wondering whether you can start up a game called Dwarf Fortress and play as the elves, Yes, yes, it's technically possible to do that. You'd have to mark the elves as playable and make sure that all their reactions are available, and then you could basically have your own collection of hippie tree singers making everything out of wood. And God, I hope the dwarves come along with a bunch of axes and chop your fucking shit down because you deserve it. However, if you wanted to experiment with other races, goblins, humans, whatever, playable civilization, set that race as playable, and off you go. By default, the only playable race is dwarves in Fortress mode. Since this is World Gen, what we care about here is whether a fortress is playable, not whether adventurers are playable. And these minimum number squares all the way down here at the bottom, these are rejection criteria. These tell us we can reject the world if it doesn't have at least this many of this square in the world. Remember, we set our settings based on the weighted mesh. These are required minimums. If your world doesn't have at least this number when it finishes, World Gen folds it up, spindles it, mutilates it, and tosses it out the door to generate a new world. And it will do that as many times as is necessary until it meets these minimums. They are rejection criteria. Now, let's talk about something I forgot to mention until this moment. So this is the last of the world gen settings. These minimum numbers, that's the end. Once you get to past high volcanism, it circles around back to the seeds we talked about at the very beginning. So that's it. That's all of world gen. We're going to hit escape. We're going to hit F6 to save. And then we're going to remember that I didn't do something else that I need to do, and I'm not sure it's on by default. So we're going to quit out of Dwarf Fortress for a moment. And I don't think it's in the noob pack settings, but let me double check so I'm not misleading you guys as to whether this is on by default. It does not track this by default, and I'm not sure if Toady has this set as the default, so we're going to go look. By default, you can have the game log the reasons why it rejects a world. Now, that's important because if you want to know why your world gen is throwing all your worlds out left, right, and center, well, it matters. This option, log map rejects, is by default no. It's not set on. If you want to know why a particular world was rejected, that is to say for example, your world gen is just running through thousands of worlds and never creating one, turning log map rejects on will tell you why you've got your settings out of whack and what you need to change in order to get your settings to stop rejecting every map that comes its way. Now we're going to save this because I like to log my map rejects. If I've done something goofy at some point, or maybe I hit enter at the wrong place while I was talking on stream, it's entirely possible that my world gen is going to have some sort of contradictory setting that forces it to reject every world it creates forever. And if you don't turn the rejects on, you don't know why it's kicking them out. That's world gen. We've covered it all. Let's start Dwarf Fortress up. And normally I would have set that before, but I forgot about it until I was actually doing world gen and talking about map rejects, and so there we are. Since that's a setting that I want Dwarf Fortress to incorporate in this game, I need to make sure that I leave the game and come back in so it pulls it out of the file, which we've done. Now, when I go back in here, remember, I hit F6 before I left, so all those settings we were tinkering with, they're still there. If I go into edit, all my seeds are still there, all my elevations and ranges and meshes and so forth, it's all still here exactly the way we left it. Make sure you save your settings before you leave the screen. Dwarf Fortress is happy to let you throw them away and not save them. It will warn you, but it won't stop you. So if you goof it, well, you're on your own. So we're going to use this custom world that we've just created here. It'll warn us that we haven't saved our changes. We're going to actually back out a second here and come back in. And I don't think I changed anything when I went in there and looked, but just in case, we're going to force it to discard any changes I did accidentally make and generate our world. Now, it rejected 54 worlds before it got to this one that it's working on. So the worlds we want. Yep, we've gotten into history, so we're generating a world. Now, notice how fast this is going on a large, and notice it start to slow down. The larger the region, the faster the slowdown will occur. The harder the slowdown will be once it starts. A couple hundred years of history is a lot of history to run on for a starting fort. You really don't need thousands and thousands of years. Now, this all comes to bear. This little thing above the history here, where it's, I'm going to pause this for a second so it doesn't run too far. This little thing above the year that says Age of Myth, that's actually a thing. Depending on what's available in the world, that might change. If, for example, all the mega beasts were dead and there were just a dwarven civilization and an elven civilization that were king of the rock, as it were, this might be the age of elves and dwarves. Or it might be the age of the three-headed hydra, if one particular mega beast is basically wreaking so much havoc that it's become like Sauron from Lord of the Rings. And you can get all kinds of different ages. Those of you who are curious about what an age can be called, I encourage you to go out there on the wiki and look. It's possible to run world history long enough that no races exist any longer and enter the age of death. Effectively, your world has died. It's still possible to play as an adventurer, but civilizations are all but extinct at that point. It's Age of Myth is the first age always. This would roughly correspond to the Lord of the Rings First Age era, where Iluvatar and the Ainur are still out wandering around remaking the world, as it were. The world is still fresh. The elves have just been created, the dwarves have just been created, the humans have just arrived in the world. That kind of thing. As history goes along, it becomes just like Lord of the Rings' Silmarillion did. You get a more historic view and a little less mythological view of how things are running along. Now, that's not to say after World Gen, just because you're in the Age of Myth, the gods are going to come along and remap your terrain on you. That doesn't exist. But it would be like adventuring right after one of those giant cataclysmic things that happened in Lord of the Rings, as long as you didn't care that no more would ever happen again. Now, you can let World Gen run as long as you want, but again, the longer it runs, the more historical figures are created, the more of them die, but still, the more that are created and are still alive, and the larger number of events that have happened in the world. How long you let it run is completely up to you. Longer histories are richer and have more critters, but may have fewer mega beasts because those tend to get killed off when they attack civilizations and fail. It's possible as history goes longer to have things like the Dwarven civilization be taken over by the goblins entirely. How things work in your world will depend on how you've set your settings up and how your seeds are going. Now, 177 years is good enough for us, so we're just going to take this as is. I'll hit use. It will write out some additional data to file, and then it's done. Now, if I hit enter at this point, we go back to the menu and our world is created and we're done. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But before we go back, there's an option right here. It says P, Export Image Info. And generally speaking, I want to do that. If you don't do it here or you forget, it's possible to do it later, but I like to make sure I've done it here because it's easy to do it. Once you hit enter, it will save the world off in its little region folder, and you can go check it out at that point. So it's offloading all 10,000 of the units that are 10,000 plus dwarves, elves, humans, goblins, kobolds, titans, and other things. Saving all of the worlds, buildings, the coins, the history events, all that stuff gets written out to files. Synchronizing our folders to make sure that they map and that all our writes are done. And we're done. So, what the hell did we just export? You're asking me? I know. I would be too. Let's go into Legends mode for a moment and see what that is. All that stuff we exported, and from Legends mode, you can export it again, which is why I said you could do it later. Historical events left to discover is 0 because we told it to reveal all of our history. If this reveal history were off, there would be historical events, but these totals would only show those people who had been discovered. Apparently, there are some unimportant people here and some unimportant sites because some of these things aren't discovered or don't exist any longer. Civilizations, underground regions, all this stuff gets mapped. And so these are events in your age. If you had multiple ages, because you let your history run long enough, you'd get multiple ages with their events down here, I believe. Now, in addition to doing it right after map export, you can export your stuff here. Export map jet info, export the various detailed maps. You can even do an XML dump. And if you do all of those dumps, Legends viewers will import them for you to provide all of this information. That XML dump takes a while, and sometimes Windows thinks Dwarf Fortress is hanging, which is why it turned white on us there for a second. That's Windows coming back and going, hey, you haven't accepted keyboard input in a while. Are you still among the living? If it runs long enough, Windows will actually ask you if the program has crashed. So if you run a really big history and you do the XML dump, it could take it a while. When you select detailed maps, you're given a collection of maps to export. Those maps work just kind of like what you'd imagine. You can export them and use them as graphics to paste on your world, stick them in a collage, however you like. If you want to see how your sites are interconnected, the migration path, if you will, that your civilizations followed as they developed, this kind of stuff is all Legends information. Now, you can get it through Legends mode. I mean, I can hit enter here and I can go in and look at any of the historical figures that exist, ones that are living and died and when, and anybody who doesn't have a born notation here was born in prehistory and hasn't died yet. So this first one, this Slatsu climax creature, the Greater Beach, a female rock, died in the year 54, but was born sometime in prehistory, in the age of prehistorical myth. Likewise, this is all of our forgotten beasts and mountain titans and hill titans and various important goblins and kobolds and dwarves and ettins, and they're all here. It's all here. When they were born, when they died, when they lived, how they lived, you name it. So let's see. This guy is dead, and he was the male mate of a hulking crone. And this is his history. And all of this information is tracked. And this is what I meant when I said that all of this stuff gets tracked. I mean, all of this stuff gets tracked and monitored. So Dwarf Fortress keeps it stored, even if it's not necessarily updating it live. This guy is no longer being updated because, well, he's dead. But for a couple of years during our World Gen, he was getting events added where he was moving around and where he was becoming the mate of this hulking crone or whatever. There you go. He's awesome. There you go. And this is when he was died. He was killed by a skinless hag spouse. So apparently, the skinless hag waged war on the hulking crone, and their minion killed this minion. And related entities, what groups he was part of, who he made enemies with, anybody he killed, his historical figures, daughters, sons, family tree, the whole 9 yards. You can filter if you're looking for somebody in particular. These are people who have the letters AE in a row. This is people with AED somewhere in their name, for example. And you could filter down on name in order to find somebody you were looking for. And this guy authored a book called My Friend Virginity. There's your random intersection with Dwarf Fortress history for today. My Friend Virginity was authored by Anna in Vale Obscure in the year of 153. Thinking Anna doesn't get around much. Poor Anna. Poor Anna. Okay, so what does that mean for you? Well, over here in the utilities, we talked about Legends Viewer, and Legends Viewer allows you to open up and then select the location where you have these archives that you've generated from Dwarf Fortress. And you'll notice that it has the files that it's looking for. This is the older region that I had previously, so we won't use that one. We tell it this one, and it's smart enough to pull in the others as well. And it will parse through that file for us and read it, and you can use, as it says, dfhacks export legends info if available. Well, we're running dfhack, so let's bounce out and do that right now. I think we actually have to have the world open, which we do in Legends mode. And it will export the additional XML info, which I think you can do from here. I think if you do this XML dump, that's what it's looking for. We haven't really talked too much about dfhack, but basically what I'm doing here is I'm inputting a console command that triggers one of the plugins and dumps out this information. Oh, maybe I've opened the wrong one. I did open the wrong one. Shame on me. This is my old civilization. This is my old world. And it correctly loaded Legends Plus this time because I loaded the right world. So let's look at the right world. Hey! So here's what's going on in our world. Mostly humans and elves. Doesn't look like there's any or there doesn't look like there's any dwarves. That's not any good. Let's see. Dwarves civilization. So there is at least one, just not very big. There's only 9 dwarves. The elves have been going absolutely hell bent for election, and the dwarves, all 9 of them, represent the entirety of the entire dwarven race. Barony incoming, kids. Barony incoming. So the dwarves have been attacked only. They have never been more than 9 of them. So apparently they've never been large enough to actually have a war. They won their only fight. This is all the wars that have occurred. Who died? Deaths by battle. In which battle? How many of all these different entities? You get where this is going. When I say that this includes everything, I mean just about everything you could name. Need to look at a historical figure? They're here. Here's what Oxut Grizzlyman is. He's a forgotten beast. He's associated with caverns, depravity, and water. These are his skills, and he hasn't done much of interesting. He's just wandering the depths of the world in the time before time. Likewise, all of your noteworthy people are here. Civilizations, if you wanted to know about our dwarven civilization we're going to be part of, because there's only one dwarven civilization in the world, this is the sum total of our entire 9 dwarves. Yay. I've never actually run a civilization this small. This'll be fun. So, our Baron will probably show up in like the second month because by month 2, our fortress is going to be the best fortress ever. Apparently, the passionate monster have been just absolutely just trying like hell to wage war on us. Sheesh. No victories for the goblins, but they keep trying. So, it looks like we've got 2 total settlements. Yay. So yeah, we're gonna be big news in the dwarf lands real quick. Leader of the attack was the anteater devil. So that means that that's part of the reason why the goblins keep screwing with us is because they've got a devil running their civilization. And apparently the goblins kidnapped some dwarves along the way. Jeesh. Poor dwarves. All 9 of them. Yikes. So, different types of art. And when I say art here, these are artifact types of art. Slabs with the secrets of life and death on them, for example, and artifact, weapons, armor, and so forth. After you've run your world for a while and retired it, you could enter Legends mode and pull your stuff in, and your stuff would be displayed right alongside all of the existing out of the box stuff. Before I bail out on World Gen information, does anybody have any questions before I go on? 2 hours already. We're not even going to get to World Gen. We're not even going to get to Embark creation tonight. Tonight we managed to create a world. It took us 2 hours to explain it to you. It wouldn't take you 2 hours at home. It'd probably take you about 5 minutes to get to where we've gotten at best. But running through all these options, and there are tons I didn't even cover, takes a lot of time. So our plan here is we'll cover, I think I'll have time to cover Embarks tonight. And that's about as much as I'm going to get done tonight. So let's close Legends Viewer for now. Come back over here to Dwarf Fortress and leave our Legends mode. Legends mode doesn't pass any time. You're literally just looking at a snapshot of the world. The other modes do pass time as time passes. When you start a fortress, it will run the first 11 days or the first 14 days. The first 2 weeks of your world will run without you. And that's this time passing right here. So this is the first 14 days of our world tick by. Bing, and then we are born on the second Sunday or the third Sunday. We get to then pick where we want to embark in the world. Now that little glowing X that you can almost kind of sort of make out right here on the world is where we are. And this is world on the right. Region is a subset of that. Local is a subset of region. Now, on smaller regions, this doesn't matter because the difference between the world map and the region map really isn't all that big. But if you look carefully, you'll notice that there's more detail on the region map for things like sites than there is on the world map. So although these, even on a small region, are very similar maps, the regional map still has additional detail that's not represented in the world map. And what you're looking at in this big morass of ASCII characters Oh, world. Yeah, okay. So a couple folks in the channel have pointed out that world gen seeds are version specific. Yes, if you change version, your seed changes with it. Seeds from older versions don't get you the same world anymore. Boo hoo. Use the same version, use the same setting, use the same seeds, you'll get the same world. Change any of that stuff, you're on your own. So, this morass of ASCII actually tells me all sorts of stuff about my world once you understand what all these different symbols mean. In particular, this blue stuff down here at the bottom is tundra. The purple stuff on the other side is evil tundra. This is a good area, this blue area here in the middle. This is ice pack, like a glacier, and ice pack along the surface. And this is evil glacier, probably up here, with a cave way up in the corner. So somebody's really hiding from the world. This is probably grasslands or hills. I'll double check and see if I can't figure out which it is here. Hang on. Move the cursor out that way. If I can keep track of my own cursor here. Looks like we're looking at shrubland here, and these green area, this dark green area is going to be swamp and marsh. These pointed arrow-like areas are trees, forests of various kinds. And so as you'll notice, we've got large swaths of swampy area and some forested area and some grassland area in which to build. But there's giant chunks of mountains and giant chunks of swamp because that's what I arranged for is these extreme areas. You must have mountains to have dwarves. No mountains, no dwarves. Since we need dwarves to play, well, that's kind of where we are. Now, let's talk a little bit about what these different screens are, because there's actually several of them. As you can hit tab, you can move through them. What do they do? Well, this is the general information. Tells you about your Embark type, the quantity of metals, how much soil, whether there's clay or sand, whether there's flux stone on site. Now, I like to embark on areas with flux stone. Some soil, sand, and clay are both nice, but I want to have shallow metals plural. Ooh, aquifer. Maybe we didn't turn aquifers off. I thought we did. That's not good. So some of this area will have aquifers. We'll have to watch out for that. That's naughty. The display here in particular, there's a difference between shallow metal singular and shallow metals plural, and you want the latter whenever possible. Which shallow metals you get will vary depending on what site you're in. Let's go down here and look at this forest for a moment. Aquifers because it's a forest, but there's shallow metal. And you can look around for a while just poking and messing. Let's say you wanted to embark on a volcano. You can look for the little up caret that's in red. That's a volcano. So if I wanted to embark on the volcano in this tile, I have to move my local area. See that little red thing in the local map is our volcano terrain right up here at the upper left corner. And this is the map we would embark on if we embarked here. It's all mountains with a volcano. Now, realistically, I don't really want to embark in an all mountain terrain. I like that whole side entrance kind of look, or some forested place where we built underground in the middle and then our castle just kind of rises up in the middle of nowhere. So let's use the site finder for a minute. I'm going to build a smaller site, so I want 3 by 3. I don't care about savagery. I want low evil. I want low or medium evil is uh, preferable if you're a new player. I don't care about elevation, temperature, drainage. I do want flux if possible. I don't want an aquifer. We might have to generate a new world because I forgot to turn aquifers off before I generated this one, apparently, because I'm an idiot. But we'll give it a go. River is whether you want to have a river. I don't care. I want multiple shallow metals. I do want deep metals. I want less than or equal deep soil. And yes, I want clay. Let's see what it finds. And we hit enter, and it will start searching for terrain. Now, it may not find what we've asked it to find. If it's not there to be found, it can't be found. But, lo and behold, the site finder has found us a couple of areas that look promising. So let's browse our results, hit escape, and we can look through these areas. This area right here is plural metals with clay and some soil. And it's in good terrain with decent amount of vegetation, not too hot, not too cold. That might be doable. Let's take a look and see if we can find someplace maybe with a creek or a stream here in this area. Not seeing a lot of streams, unfortunately. That's kind of a shame. Let's go look at this other one up here. Likewise, no streams. Interesting. Wonder if I set something wrong because I'm not seeing any streams anywhere, and usually there's rivers everywhere. Fascinating. Embark Assistant. No, I haven't seen that one. Is that DF Hack? I don't see an option here. Yeah, Embark Assistant would be new. I haven't seen that one. I'm used to using the vanilla functionality to pick my Embark site. Okay, well, I haven't looked at that one, so sometime in the next couple of days, I'm gonna have to browse what Embark Assistant is. I'm guessing it's we're having it described as an expanded version of our Site Finder, which could be kind of useful actually, because Site Finder sometimes can be a little restrictive in terms of what it finds. Now, it's important to notice that larger local areas mean that there's more tiles in your map. More tiles in your map is more stuff. More stuff, well, we covered that, didn't we? Area on the surface matters to you. So if I embark in this local area, I'm really only embarking on this corner at the moment. And depending on what type of map I'm looking at, that's going to tell me about my elevation. It's going to tell me about my cliffs and how many hills and breaks I can expect to find on my map. Type of terrain, my neighbors. Now, unfortunately, there are no goblin neighbors here, so if I embark in this area, I don't even think I get goblins for an age. So we'll see if we can embark somewhere. Maybe there's some goblins. Hey, there's goblins, and we're at war with them. This looks promising. So let's see. What do we got here? Relatively flat, no cliffs. Let's go up and get all marshy terrain. This is Joyous Wild, so this is high savagery, but good. Now, we're a little sparse on trees because this is savanna. That's not ideal for a new player, so let's go look at that third area up here in this swampy area here. Now, this is cold, so we'll get sand, soil, clay, metals, and flux on the same site. That's a good spot for a new player right there. It looks like, depending on where we embark, we may or may not get the sand. Okay, and if we embarked here, we actually cover two biomes. This biome is F1 for me, and this biome is F2. Now notice, biome 2 does not have multiple metals. And this works exactly like you'd expect. Um, you can embark in an area that has an aquifer on half your map and not an aquifer on the other half of your map. In fact, let me double check that now because I wanted to make sure there's no aquifer on the site before I embark. And you can dig around the aquifer using the area of the biome that's not in the aquifer. So, say for example, this flashing biome in green here actually had an aquifer in it. I could build the entrance to my fort in the southwest corner of my map, dig down below the aquifer, and then expand out to the north and the east underneath the aquifer as long as I didn't breach it. And I'd be perfectly safe because I've effectively dug around the aquifer. You're not always going to be able to dig around aquifers, so if you have to deal with them, you're going to have to go out at some point on the wiki and read up on how to pierce an aquifer and follow all the little steps in the guide, or turn them off. For new players, it's easier just to turn them off and not deal with them. But if you're wanting to deal with Dwarf Fortress the way it was built, turn them on and go study. Now, I don't really care too much about that second biome. It doesn't look like it's all that valuable to me. We have the same amount of soil on both biomes, and there's less metal in this second biome. But let's see what's really there. So let's highlight this first biome. Come over here to Dwarf Hack, DF Hack. We'll prospect. Prospect is one of Dwarf Fortress's TF Hack add-ons, and it will tell us about materials on the site we're looking at. In particular, these are the layers you've got and the number of tiles in that layer, and the Z levels where they occur. So for example, I know that this material, or that on this site, I'm going to have sphalerite, tetrahedrite, native copper, native gold, and native aluminum. And approximately, although not necessarily exactly, this number of tiles of each. It also includes your gems and your other vein stone and your layer stones. Now, this is useful or important if you plan to do particular types of things like pottery. Certain types of clay get made into earthenware and others get made into porcelain. And the difference is not just in terms of value, but in terms of how they have to be used. Earthenware has to be glazed, porcelain does not. Stoneware does not. So if you want to have stoneware, you have to have the appropriate type of clay for it, otherwise you're going to be glazing your stuff. Likewise, if you plan to make glass, you're going to need access to sand. If you don't have sand on site, that means importing all your sand, and it means you won't have a glass industry because you can't have a glass industry if you have to import the sand. There's just not enough imports to keep your sand industry running. So, having sand and clay on site means that we'll be able to do both glass works and pottery works on site without needing to do any importing. Now, the downside of where we've chosen to embark is there's no iron, so our iron would have to be imported. But goblins will import iron by default, and humans can be convinced to bring you iron, and dwarves can bring you iron. So we can import our iron if we have to. And tetrahedrite can be used to make bronze. So that'll work in a way. But we don't have any cassiterite. And no cassiterite means no bronze, because if you don't have tin, you can't make bronze. Tetra, don't think you can make bronze out of tetrahedrite normally by itself. So we have copper, but no bronze. So that's not ideal for a new player. Ideally, you'd want to have at least bronze. That's cassiterite and one of the copper ores. And for those of you who don't know what those are, I'll save you the geology lesson. You can go Google it on the wiki for now. But suffice to say that you're going to know what all the different stone ores manufacture before you're done. Sphalerite makes zinc, for example. Zinc is not a weaponable material, so that's not particularly useful for us. So if that site doesn't work, well, let's take a look somewhere else. So let's move around a little bit here. Let's go back to that first set of sites and see if we can't find something in here that doesn't appeal to us a little bit. This one had everything we thought we liked, right? We thought. Good, good craw or good amount of, oh, but this one didn't have the neighbor. Damn, what a shame. Had what I liked, everything except no goblins adjacent. That's a pity. Well, okay, let's embark somewhere less than ideal. So we'll do a second world real quick. Let's see how long it takes us to do one real fast. I don't think it'll take us very long at all. Go into edit. We'll change this to something else, like, I don't know. And keep in mind, I'm only changing the terrain seed, if you will. Our history and name and creature seeds will tend to follow the same general rules. It's not guaranteed they'll follow exactly the same historical path, but there'll be some rhyming notes. Let's just go ahead and generate that world and see how it goes. Hey, I see rivers. That's a plus. Didn't see any rivers the first time. It was really strange, for the record. Usually there's some rivers somewhere. Okay, that's enough. Don't need that much history. Notice you'll start to see roads generated. That's good. That's good stuff. It means our civilizations are linking up. These are dwarven civilizations here. It looks like we may even have multiples because it looks like maybe they crossed over. And it looks like anything up here in the north is probably going to be close enough to the evil terrain to get us some goblins before long. So that's good too. Don't see any towers, which is unfortunate, but let's go ahead and use this world for now. And we'll go ahead and I'll generate our images and info. Offload our units and pull him up in World Gen. We're on a small world map, and the reason is intentional so that I cut down on the amount of time we spend watching World Gen run. Downsides to spawning a smaller world map. Yes, kind of. Not major downsides, but smaller maps mean your mega beasts have less terrain to cross to find your civilizations and kill them. So small terrains with large numbers of mega beasts tend to have fewer civilizations because they get found and killed faster. Just that simple. It's kind of an organic process, so exactly where the breakdown occurs is hard for me to delineate for you. But the gist is, more mega beasts, less room to run, fewer civilizations survive. Okay, so let's take a look at, let's go into World Gen. legends on the second region, that second world we just created real fast. Still not sure why it didn't give me any rivers in that first map. That's really fucking weird. And we'll do the XML export and watch Dwarf Fortress freak out here for a moment. Dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum. Really strange. It's possible to get entirely degenerate world gens where the civilizations just get killed right out of the gate. It's possible to get some where nothing major happens for hundreds of years. Random is random. So Clanadev here has pointed out to us that Embark Assistant will allow us to pick things like evil sites with thralling weather, iron, gold, emerald, sand, and in a forest just because. And you can specify your Embark that precisely, and it will much more carefully find them for you. I think that did the export. Let's double check. Did not. There's region 2 world map. Apparently we didn't export the stuff, so we'll do it again. Damn you, Dwarf Fortress! You can do the exports as many times as you like. It won't hurt anything. You're just overwriting the same files each time, so no harm, no foul. Not responding to keyboard input. There we go. Okay, good. Odd. Oh, I didn't resort the types. Region 2, Region 2. That's what we wanted. Okay, good. We'll fire up Legends Viewer again. Not too worried about Legends XML Plus in this case, but we could do the export there if we need to. There's a few more dwarves available in this civilization, and 2 dwarven civilizations. We're living high on the hog now. Yeah, that's much better. 178 dwarves in one and 1,800 in the other. I can live with that. That whole 9 dwarves alive thing, that was going to end badly. Maybe we'll come back to that world after we've done a couple. There's a couple of kobolds. There's a kobold civilization, 2 humans, 2 goblins, 2 elves. This will work. This is good. Okay, so let's use this guy. Let's do the export for legends as well. And as always with a console, it helps if you can type. Visit that other world later, not as our first fort out of the gate. Having to deal with a barony on like month 2 is a little beyond the average new player. Okay, so we'll pick our world. We'll take that second region we created. Notice that the names are the same. That's intentional. We told it to use the same name seed, so civilizations got named the same way, and things developed a little differently because we changed the terrain, but the names got used with this. The names got initialized the same way. So our region names will tend to come out the same, and our world name is the same. People will tend to be named the same to an extent. Okay, as before, same thing. We go over here. We want a 3x3. We want low evils. Find a good area first if we can. We do want flux. We want multiple shallow metals. We want deep metals. We want less than or equal to deep. Actually, yeah. And we want yes to clay. And we'll see what it can find us. At least some, because there's 2 spots way up here at the northwest that got marked as yes. Okay, so there's definitely some. All right. So let's go browse those results and see what we get. So let's kick over to the neighbors first, because we want to have some place that has goblin neighbors or necromancer neighbors or somebody who's actually going to attack us neighbors at least some point along the way. Ah, dwarves, elves, goblins, and a tower. Bonus. Oh, we are all over that one. That's fantastic. Okay, so this world is actually going to have a tower if we generate it in the right place. Awesome. Towers get you necromancer invasions and sieges and not just goblins. So if you want to mess around with necromancers, embarking where there's a tower is a useful thing because it will make the necromancer come and visit you periodically. And this area down here looks like it has goblins too, so good. Plenty of neighbors this time. It's not any fun if you don't get to make friends with the neighbors. Okay, so let's go back up here to this kind of swampy area here, kick over to our mineral type area here, and then let's start tooling around a little bit in this zone looking for things that have multiple metals. It looks like aquifers are going to be our problem here because the sand desert has the metals we want, but also aquifers. I really should have turned that off before we regenerated this world. Let's do that. Since we've kept all the same settings, remember guys, kept everything the same. Bounce out real quick. We'll do a real fast one. Watch this. Didn't like the way it came out? This is Dwarf Fortress in a nutshell. Thousands of people flushed into my recycle bin. Just that easy. Flushed. Go back over here, make sure we disable aquifers because I'm an idiot and can't read simple options in the GUI after I've spent all this time talking about it. Because I covered that I'm an idiot, right? Okay. Go back into Dwarf Fortress. Recreate the world. Keeping the same settings and seeds, so we're going to get the same world just with no aquifers. We didn't save our settings last time, did we? Nope, we didn't, but we can fix that. You'll notice that we got, well, the same terrain as last time because we told it to use the same seeds. That's exactly their function. So, folks asking me whether I use mostly vanilla. Yes, almost completely vanilla. We'll use DF Hack for a few things because it's nice to have around, and we'll use Dwarf Therapist for modifying labors because anybody who doesn't is a masochist. But generally speaking, we're not going to be tweaking our stuff too much. The aquifer, getting rid of the aquifers is about the most modding I do on most of my games. We'll hit accept, and this map is going to be just like the other map, only if we didn't end in the same year, maybe some of the stuff hasn't happened yet. We're not as far along in history as we were last time. Is it possible to embark in an area where no one will attack you even as wealth increases? Titans will always attack because they're assumed to always be able to get to where you are. And as long as you are away from goblins, don't go out starting trouble, don't be picking on your neighbors, they've got no reason to come looking for you. That's not to say it won't happen eventually. I mean, eventually, if the world runs on long enough, the humans and the dwarves will expand out their settlements, and somebody will plant a neighborhood next to you, and the next thing you know, you're a major trade hub, and then somebody's going to notice you, and somebody else is going to take offense at you. And that's where it starts. So let's go ahead and start this in Dwarf Fortress mode again. This time with 100% less aquifer. And we've run the same 2 weeks like 4 times now. Bet those Einar and Lord of the Rings never had this problem. Okay, so we'll again use the Sight Finder because it's awesome, at least out of the box. And we want to have Flux, and we want to make sure we don't have an Aquifer this time because we know we won't. And multiple, and yes, and less than deep, and yes. If you want to attain the maximum level of soil, you'll have to leave this off. Unfortunately, this is less than or equal to deep, and there is a very deep, which is like 4+ levels of soil. You're not guaranteed to get the highest level if you set this, but you are guaranteed to get some. So we can hit enter and he'll search and he'll probably find those same sites, only he'll be a little broader this time because we turned aquifers off. So a lot of stuff that wasn't accessible before no longer has an aquifer and now is accessible. So this entire area here in this little notch would not have worked for us before because there would have been an aquifer present previously, and there is no longer an aquifer because we turned them off. Likewise, this area expanded a little bit, but this area mostly didn't exist before, and it's now viable as well. Most of this looks like it's evil terrain, hence the purple color. So we probably won't embark there to start, but it'll be interesting for down the road. If we keep using the same world, we may embark there later. So let's go ahead and take a look at that new area that it created and say, okay, well, what's in here? We got soil, looks like clay, not pinging off sand anywhere, which is nice to have, but not must have. Clay, likewise, is nice to have, not must have. Metals and some soil, at least a little soil, is more important than nothing. And really, you can get by without the soil if you're willing to do some irrigation. Metals are the hardest things to metals and flux, I should say, are the hardest things to replace. Flux is the absolute hardest because you can only get flux by importing, and you can only get about 4 stones in an import, so you can only get about 12 stones of flux a year, which means you can only make about something like 4 bars of steel a year, something like 3 bars of steel a year. I don't remember the exact breakdown. Just is you're not going to make much steel if you don't have flux. So have flux or go bust, your choice. You can get iron, even on sites with no iron, by having the iron imported. Goblins will bring it as weapons. Humans and dwarves will bring it in their caravans. Bronze is the same way. Humans, dwarves, and goblins will all bring that. If it's lower than bronze on the totem pole, it's probably not useful as a weapon outside of the very, very early game. So all those elven wooden weapons are very cute to look at, but we won't use them any longer than is absolutely necessary. Our civilians use wooden weapons. Everybody else gets proper weapons. And the civilians will eventually get proper weapons before we're done. Okay, so let's look at our maps. This is a relatively flat elevation with no cliffs. It is moderately forested, but not super heavy trees. And it's high savagery, but not good. So we're going to expand our embark 1 tile to the west so that I have a 3x4 embark so that we can incorporate the river. And this isn't a river, actually, it's a brook. Brooks are worth noting because they are walkable and not deep enough to be swam in. So you can't have invaders come in through your brook. You can have invaders swim in through your stream if the stream goes under your wall, but your brook is effectively treated like a floor. It has water, but nobody can get into the water normally. So this looks like a reasonable spot. I like to have a river for an access to water. Those of you who have aquifers might want to embark away from it. Even sites that are not on a river will have access to surface water in the form of pools. Those can be drained off and stored. If you want to have a cistern where you fill it with native pools, that is certainly doable. Generally speaking, I like my source of water to be slightly more reliable than that, so I tend to want to embark somewhere where there's a river or an aquifer or, God forbid, an ocean, so that I can get some clean water for my hospital and for my dwarves to drink in extremis. In the meantime, this looks like a good spot. We only cover the one biome. We have all the metals we want. Let's double check prospect. Okay, prospect says we're going to have bronze but no iron. I can live with that. I'm okay with having bronze. Copper as a tool or a weapon material and being the only material you have, which is what we would have had with that other site that only had tetrahedrite. So not only were we going to be 9 dwarves, we were going to be 9 dwarves with no access to steel or bronze or iron. That would have been rough. But here we're going to have access to copper and tin and zinc and silver. So gold, silver, tetrahedrite is both silver and copper. Sphalerite is zinc, and cassiterite is tin. So that's a good collection of weaponable and craft type metals. A reasonable selection of gems. I can honestly tell you I've never rejected a site based on gems, but if you were going to try and build something that required you to have uh, pink tourmalines, for example, there you go. You're going to have this many pink tourmalines, tiles of pink tourmaline. You may or may not get that many pink tourmalines. We're going to have clay, but did that say sand? Clay, but no sand. So no glass industry this time out. That's okay. We can live with that. And our clay is not. There's only one type of clay that makes porcelain stoneware out of the gate, and it's not this kind. Um, so we'll have to do earthenware, and we'll have to glaze our clay pots before they can be used. So clay will be a nice, how do I put this? Nice to have industry, not a must have industry. We'll make stone pots primarily instead of clay pots because we don't have to glaze the stone pots. None of the rest of this is stuff I would normally reject, although I will note that hornblende actually contains uranium, so good to know that our site is at least partially radioactive. No, it doesn't have any game effects for those of you wondering. It's just cute. Fairly standard layer stones here, nothing particularly exotic. That's pretty much the works. At this point, I have everything I need to know to embark or to not embark or to choose a different site. This tells us everything we need to know about our general terrain. This tells us who our neighbors are. Oh, god damn, no goblin neighbors. Fuck. Well, that ain't gonna work. I want neighbors, damn it. Thought for sure there's fucking goblin settlements. I could see them right there. Not close enough? Really? Other side of the mountains. I'll be damned. There's a little fucking peninsula of mountains right there that separates us. Son of a bitch. Well, so much for the best site ever, right, guys? Let's find something else. Okay, let's go over here. Got goblins. Actually, wait a minute. Let's go do that other one. Wasn't there a tower, too? Yeah! There we go. Now we're talking. Let's see if we can get one. I'll bet only the desert has the necessary. I'll bet if I go over here, we get shallow metals. That's why this one showed up, is because it only showed up if you're on that spot right there. Well, I don't really want to do a desert as our first time out, guys. That's a little rough for a new player, but if I can find a spot adjacent to the stream in the desert, also with some trees, it doesn't look like we're going to get it though, because this looks like grassland for the most part. So let's skip that bad boy and check out this south end down here, because that's got plenty of metals and sand, which is nice. Any streams? Yeah, there's one there. Okay, good. And shallow metals, deep metals, soil. Good, good, good. And expand one out. Okay, so that's shallow metal, deep metals. Goblins as a neighbor. And we'll check prospect one more time. We'll have bronze, but not much. That's not ideal. It'll work, but that's a low amount of tin. 1,000 units means you have to scrape to find all the tin you've got. Let's wiggle around a little bit and see if we can't find someplace close that's not right there. It looks like gotta stay in the marsh if we want all of our metals. Try prospect here real quick. Still rough, but doable. Galena is silver and lead. Malachite is copper. Garnierite is lead, I believe. Cassiterite is tin, and bismuthinite is used to make bismuth bronze, which is a particular type of bronze. You have to have the cassiterite first anyway, but which is much more valuable and slightly better as a weapon, but it's also you have to have the bismuth as well as the rest, and bismuth is pretty rare. So you normally won't get too much of that no matter what you do. There's more there's more bronze to be had here than there was in the other site, but that ain't saying much. Let's see how far away we can go and still get goblin neighbors. Oh, nickel. Garnierite is nickel. My bad. Pay a lot less attention to the non-weaponable metals because you really don't normally care. It's either usable as a weapon or it just gets made into crafts and you don't care what kind it is. So hot, scorching with few trees. Hmm. No real streams around either. That's a pity. Oh, one there. That might work. Let's take a look there. Neither one of those is an evil biome, and I have to check because if I go one north of here, I get 3 biomes, and the third biome is the evil biome. You can tell because it's marked as haunted over here. We're trying to avoid that out of the gate. Oops, oops, oops. Don't want to do that. I want to do this. There we go. So this set of biomes is not in the evil terrain, has metals and soil and clay. Prospect says this is a fantastic site for a new player. Okay. Fire clay is the type of clay that is used to make stoneware out of the gate, so no glazing required on our clay pots if we want. That's nice, but not essential. Limonite is or limonite, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, it is an iron ore. It's yellow in color, and we will have iron available to us right out of the gate. Sphalerite will make zinc, tetrahedrite makes copper. No cassiterite means no tin, no bronze, but we'll have enough to make at least a reasonable supply of iron, basic iron weapons. And we can work on making steel since this site does have a flux layer and can support steel making. Now, it used to be the case, and I don't know that it is still the case. I want to check one thing. I think Prospect is smarter now than it used to be. It used to be it was biome specific, so it would list whichever biome you were looking at, but it now looks like it does the whole biome or the whole Embark, which is good. That saves new players a point of confusion, and I hadn't tested that recently, so I wasn't sure. So it doesn't matter which one you have, it will show you what's there. Now notice we're also going to have bituminous coal, which is the better type of coal. So in addition to being able to make iron, we'll be able to make iron with an actual coal smelter instead of having to rely on lava forging, which is nice. It's really nice. So this is a workable site. And in the absence of any objections, this works. Let's do this. So we'll hit E to embark here. And then it brings up a whole list of options. And out of the box, all of these options probably exist for you. And you could select any of them you wanted, but we're going to prepare for the journey carefully. Why? Because I'm going to throw out everything. All of it gone. Gone, 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 gone. Throwing out every item that it told us we were going to bring. I'm throwing them all out. All of them. We'll start from scratch, and I'll explain to you what I would do, what I would bring, why I would bring it, the whole 9 yards from scratch, as though you were coming in and you had no idea how Dwarf Fortress worked. So let's start with and you can switch between items and skills, which use the same embark points. Remember we had those 1504 embark points? If you give everything back, that's how many points you end up with. And you'll use that for skills on your dwarves as well as animals you bring with you and items you bring with you on your embark. Now things have changed since the last time I played a little bit, but not enough that we're going to do things wildly differently than we would have in the past. In particular, we're going to go down here to the second page and make every one of these dwarves that we start with into a uh, novice discipline skill. And the reason we're doing this is the discipline skill is necessary to tolerate the exposure to dead bodies and body parts and other stuff that's got to be buried. And unfortunately, of all the dwarves in your fortress, your starting 7 are the most likely dwarves to have an opportunity to encounter dead bodies and body parts. And if you have an unfortunate incident early on, and you don't have the way to get rid of the bodies, your dwarves spend all their time getting horrified instead of getting any work done, and they all starve to death because somebody had the unfortunate tendency to kill a mason standing next to the wagon, and they're all freaking out about it for the next 6 months before they go mad from stress and starvation and die, which sucks. So don't do that. Give your guys discipline. Let them bury their buddies if they need to. Now you can get by with just one of them doing this if you want. Just make sure he's not the one that dies. Good luck. So, out of the gate, we're going to take a miner. And it used to be in past years, I would not have taken a miner, but this time we are going to. And the reason is, in the newer versions of Dwarf Fortress, stress is a real concern. And part of the ways we mitigate stress is by early on getting access to a temple and a tavern and all those quality of life sorts of rooms that our dwarves want to have. Starting off with a miner and a pick and then making some more very quickly will allow us to get a head start on digging things and have one or more skilled diggers who will perform at a reasonable rate while still allowing other dwarves to participate later once additional picks are made. Now, picks are expensive, and we won't take too many of them because it's cheaper to take the raw materials and make them and use the extra raw materials to make axes and armor and other goodies than it is to take the picks and just have the picks. Unfortunately, picks also take time to make, time to set the workshops up, time to move the ores around, and all that other good stuff. And that time can eat into the time you need to prepare defenses and get your temple up and your temple and your taverns and such up and running. And so, while we are going to uh, perform the standard make your picks on site process that I normally would, we are going to bring a pick to get us started with some early underground burrows fairly quickly. And so I'm going to take these first two guys and I'm going to make them both into miners. I'm going to take this next guy and I'm going to make him into a carpenter. It's a good idea to take a carpenter with you. Beds can only be made out of wood, and a carpenter is the only guy who can make them. I like to take a mason out of the gate because we're going to be making blocks pretty quick. We're going to take a weaponsmith because we're going to make picks. We're going to take a grower because we're going to make some crops. No grower means it's hard to plant. And we're going to give our grower a sideline in armor smithing so that he has something he can do if he gets chosen to be the miracle mood worker of the day. He's going to do it as an armor smith and not just as whatever random shit the grower comes up with. Let's see. Did anybody else? Miners, carpenters, masons, weaponsmiths, and armor smiths, it's worth noting, are all what are called moodable skills. If dwarves have one of their crazy moments and decide to make an artifact, and they have a moodable skill, they will use their highest moodable skill to determine what type of artifact they make. If Weaponsmith is the highest moodable skill in all your dwarves, you're going to get a lot of artifact weapons. If Armorsmith is the highest skill in all your dwarves, you're going to get a lot of artifact armor pieces, and so on. Now, some are better than others. Crafts obviously aren't worth as much to you as artifacts as an artifact weapon or artifact armor would be, but it's not crucial that you make sure you have 47,000 dwarf smiths and dwarf armor smiths to get. Uh, uh, it's not essential that you have 47 dwarf smiths to make sure everybody's producing weaponable moods, unless that's really the measure of success you're measuring your fortress by. Now, in addition to those smiths, it's useful to consider taking a few other things. A few points in Herbalist will allow you to pick crops that you find on site. Now, you can get away with doing this en masse by just dispatching lots and lots of dwarves, and as long as you're not trying to survive on it, you'll get a few of the crop you need, and then you can replant it in farm plots, and at that point you have basically domesticated the plant. So there's two schools of thought. One is take a guy with a couple of points in the skill and let him be the exclusive go get the wild plants guy, or don't take the points on anybody and let them just sort of do it in parallel. Have a bunch of unskilled dwarves go out and somebody's going to get lucky to get the thing we need. Generally speaking, I don't invest points in Herbalist anymore. I used to, when I was first starting out, have a couple points just so I'd have a dwarf I know could gather the stuff, but now it usually doesn't matter. Likewise, a lot of these skills are better done in parallel by unskilled dwarves. Uh, while mutable skills are nice to have high on one dwarf, one skill per dwarf, if you will, a lot of these other skills aren't mutable. I don't care how many points in fisherman you have, you're a cheesemaker. I don't care how many points in cheesemaking you have, you're a furnace operator, and so forth. It doesn't really matter which dwarves are doing those things if you're also doing them en masse in parallel. If you have 12 furnace operators running simultaneously, the fact that none of them are master furnace operators doesn't matter because 12 of them produce faster than the one guy does unless he's under some very favorable circumstances. Sure, he works faster, but he doesn't work 12 times faster normally. And he also can't go get 12 ores at the same time and 12 fuels at the same time, and your other dwarves can. And so as they scale up through repeated use of the skill, it Doesn't matter that they started off as masters when you've got 12 of them and they're all middling, because the 12 middling guys is better than one master. The exception to that is mutable skills, and mutable skills matter because they have quality ratings. There's no such thing as high quality charcoal. There is such a thing as high quality breastplates. Low quality breastplates just aren't as good. High quality breastplates are not only worth more, they protect better, at least marginally better. It may not be wildly better, but marginally better. Artifacts protect even better than that if you have them. So it's important to think about what kind of skills we want our dwarves so that everybody has a mutable skill that they'll mood into, and also that all of the other skills that aren't done in parallel by unskilled dwarves have specialists who will attend to them. So, for example, growing is not a mutable skill. So our grower we have a skilled specialist grower, specifically because although that can be done en masse by unskilled dwarves, having a proficient grower out of the gate means we can actually plant crops and feed our dwarves. A pile of unskilled dwarves won't get as much food out of their crops and will need to do other things to offset and augment their food production in the early game. Now, later on, when you've got 150 dwarves, you've got more surplus dwarf labor than you know what to do with, you won't care, because 100 unskilled dwarves can easily produce enough food to feed the other 100. And plus, there's things you can do to augment your food stocks, livestock, ordering food from the caravans, and so forth. But if you want to be able to plant crops right out of the gate, it helps to have a proficient grower. Now, this last guy is kinda up to you. What do you want? What kind of things would you want in your fort? If you want a hunter, you can give them that skill. It's worth noting that if you give them ambusher, which is the hunting skill, and crossbow bowyer skill so that they can make their own stuff, maybe leather working so they can make their own quivers, that kind of thing. If ambusher is their highest skill, they'll actually start with some basic hunting gear right out of the gate. So that's nice to have. It'll give you a basic crossbow quiver and some bolts. It's not enough to run you for long, but it's nice to have maybe in that first month if the key has come to try and steal all your anvils. So let's see what do we got here that's new and exciting. Nothing really new and exciting that's actually working, because none of these new things that Toadie's added down here at the bottom of the list actually do anything. Nobody cares about mathematician because nobody's mathematicianing anything. We could create a record keeper out of the gate, or let's create ourselves a broker character. A broker character will need appraiser, judge of intent. It helps if they have liar, and if you're going to give them liar, it's also useful to give them consoler, because normally dwarves can't have both. But if you give a dwarf both, they start with both and they can work on both and they can develop both. So our dwarf here would work his way up as a consoler. So this guy's gonna kinda be focused on like manager type tasks. So we'll probably make him our manager. We'll set him out as a novice, make him competent appraiser. And so he's kind of our noble, if you will, out of the gate. He's not particularly useful. Folks pointing out that mathematician is used to make math books. Yes, mathematician is indeed used to make math books. Math books have, well, you can read them. That's about as much function as they have in the current version of Dwarf Fortress. You can read them. So we've kind of covered skills, and you'll notice I could assign up to 4 more skills to these other dwarves, but I don't really have a use for those points at the moment, so we're going to leave it alone for now, and maybe we'll come back. We're going to go over here to items and create some new items, and we're going to start with the most important item that you could possibly choose to bring. Generally speaking, if you are a new player, thou shalt bring an iron anvil. If you cannot bring an iron anvil, thou shalt bring a steel anvil. If you do not bring an anvil, so be it, it's on your head. No anvil means no metalworking until you get an anvil. You can't make an anvil without an anvil, which begs the question, of course, where the first anvil came from. But no anvil, no metalwork, no additional anvils. So take an anvil. You are not guaranteed to get an anvil in any caravan. You could theoretically go years without a caravan or without an anvil. Take an anvil. Yes, I can hear the expert players out there in the audience chiming in to say that they once ran a fortress on Toe Jam and wooden weapons for 14 years and managed to survive until the 15th caravan finally brought him an anvil. Good for them. You're a new player. Take an anvil. That said, you don't need to take much in the way of completed metal works. About the only completed metal object we're going to take is a copper pick. And the only reason we're taking a copper pick and not an iron pick is that it's cheaper. They work the same. There's no real difference unless you're using them as a weapon. When it comes to mining, copper picks and iron picks and steel picks are all the same. When it comes to weapons, there's a difference. So we'll start off with a copper pick to give our miners something to do we take two miners or just one? I've forgotten. I got to go look. Double check. Over here, tab down. This guy's a miner, that guy's a miner, so we need two. So we'll set ourselves to have two copper picks. And picks are expensive, so I won't usually take more than two. Two is an outside. Now there's a couple of other tricky bits here that used to be different in prior versions. It used to be the case that you could make wooden training axes and use your wooden training axes to cut trees and use your wood to make more wooden training axes to cut more trees. That doesn't work anymore. You have to have iron or bronze or copper axes to cut trees. Metal axes or bust. Which is kind of weird because, you'd think somebody would have made a stone axe at some point. I'm fairly certain some Neolithic dwarf would have come up with the idea that they could put a stone on a stick and chop something with it, but, maybe not. Guess not. Apparently nobody bothered to, make Neolithic flint implements, I guess. Anyway, Toady has never implemented them. So, that's great, I hear you say. We've got copper picks, but how do we make anything else out of copper? Well, this is where a little bit of back knowledge comes in handy. Here we're going to want stone. Yes, you could take metal bars, but a single copper bar is 10 points, meaning you get one bar, you spend 10 points. If I instead, however, brought, say, some malachite, a unit of malachite is 6, and you'll get more than one bar out of it when you burn it down. So, malachite is not just cheaper, it's more cost effective. Now, you might not have access to malachite, so some other things to look for: malachite, native copper. You can take tetrahedrite, but that's a little more expensive because it also yields you for some silver as well as some copper. Uh, but if you've got a copper ore and cassiterite, you can make bronze on the spot. And that's probably what we're going to start with. So what we'll do is we'll take malachite, native copper, or one of the other copper-containing ores. Let's see if they're right here at the top. See if I can run down through them and spot them real quick. I think there's a third one, and it's slipping my mind. Copper nuggets, maybe. Looks like this is all we've got, and I'm not seeing the other one I'm remembering. Thought there was a third one, but it's escaping my brain. It's been too long since I've played. Iron ores are magnetite, limonite, which is up here on the first page, and hematite, which I don't think I saw hematite in the list, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. I wasn't really looking. Doesn't look like we have any hematite to take. Our civilization doesn't have access to a source of hematite. Likewise, if your civilization doesn't have access to native copper and tetrahedrite, look for malachite. If you don't have access to any of them, then you're going to be forced to import. But we have access to copper ores in the form of malachite. So we're going to take some malachite, and we're going to take some cassiterite, and then we're going to take some coal. Ooh, no coal. That's a pity. No coal. Bummer. Okay, well, charcoal is expensive, so we're going to take a unit of coke, and we'll make some more coal on site using wood, which sucks because it's slow. Unfortunately, that means that our metalworking is going to kind of be backed up by the necessity to cut trees, bake the wood into charcoal, and then use the charcoal in the reactions necessary. That's not ideal, but it's workable. Take a few malachites, take a few cassiterites. We really only need one coke, and that's just to prime the cycle. But realistically, we're going to want more than we're going to end up with. So normally what we would do is we would take coal and we would use one unit of coke to make the coal into more coke, and then use the more coke to make more coke, and you kind of see where that's going until we're all coked out. And then you can use the coke as the fuel for your metalworking. In this case, we're going to make wood into charcoal, and you don't need any fuel to do that. So we can save ourselves 10 points, which is good, but we lose it on the time it's going to take to make our charcoal, which is bad. In fact, overall, it's probably worse than ideal. Okay, malachite, cassiterite. So now we can make our bronze on the site to make bronze tools with. That's good. What else do we need? Well, we're going to need seeds because you're going to want to plant stuff. And you're going to want all the seeds in the underground category, with the exception of dimple cups. Why not dimple cups? Well, dimple cups are actually a dye and not a food plant, so we really don't care if you start with them or not. But the rest of these you're going to want to have a few of. And rock nuts in particular are dangerous to take only one of. Not dangerous in the sense of will kill your dwarves, but dangerous in the sense of rock nuts also double as a food source. So if your dwarves get hungry, it's possible they eat your seeds before you've had a chance to plant them. And you really don't want them to eat the last seed before you've had a chance to plant it. So make sure you take a few rock nuts and not just one, just as a precaution. In addition, we're probably going to take some meat or fish. And it's worth noting that there still is the old trick where if you took lots and lots of different types of meat and fish, say one each of a bunch of different kinds, and you don't have them set up to mix, you get a different quantity of barrels depending on which types of things you brought. So cave fish gets stored separately from cave lobster, which gets stored separately from prepared hyena brains, which gets stored separately from prepared firefly livers, and so forth. And each of those different foods, since they're not set up to mix, gets its own barrel, which means you start off with a few extra barrels. Now, this is worth mentioning because barrels are actually really expensive to start with, but they're included for free if you have a few different types of food. So having a few extra food types just to con a couple extra barrels out of the system is ideal. Someone's pointing out to me that the different types of coal are under stone, but I know that I can just look for coal or I can look for lignite, so I can hit lig, and we have no lignite. And I can look for coal, for bituminous coal, and we have no coal. This civilization does not have access to either of the two types of coal. So our site, which has bituminous coal, as according to Prospect, is going to be the first site in our civilization with access to coal. So, yay! And let's see, where does that leave us? Okay, so we added fish, some basic types of fish. Let's add drinks. Generally speaking, you need at least one type of drink because although your dwarves can live off water, you really don't want them to. It slows them down, it makes them angry. Dwarves get angry over the slightest things anymore, so you're not going to want to make them angry over anything more than you absolutely have to. And that means taking plenty of booze, which we normally would have kind of shorted ourselves on in prior years. So we'll start off with a good sample of lungfish. And again, I don't really care too much. I don't need a huge amount of this, just enough to get started. And we'll need to take some dwarven liquors of various types. The advantage of taking multiple types, again, is that the wine isn't stored in the same barrel with the ale or the beer or the rum. So once that one unit of beer goes away or that one unit of ale goes away because it gets drunk, well, then you're left with a barrel, which is good because you can reuse the barrel for other things. So, food and drink. Settled. Oops. What else do we need? Well, let's run down through the list. We won't take weapons or training weapons because it's cheaper to make those on site. Ammo, anvils, leather, again, all cheaper to make on site. In fact, I wouldn't take leather out of the gate because out of the gate, your wagon comes with two draft animals who you can immediately butcher and then convert to leather. That's 2 units of leather out of the gate for free without having to bring any. That's over and above the meat and the bones and so forth that those animals will provide you. If you're in evil terrain and you must have a leather object of some kind, whatever it might be, probably better to take the leather up front than to try to butcher it and make the leather. It can be done, but if you're not quick about it, your butchered skins will come back to life and try to smother your dwarves, which is bad. So don't do that. Cloth is actually more expensive than taking the raw materials, so we'll skip that for now. Wood, we'll want to bring some. Yes, I know I can hear you saying, but you're on a forested site. Why are you taking logs? Well, it helps to take a few logs. Plus, I like the nice white look of tower cap logs. So we'll take some tower cap logs, and not too many, just enough to get some basic beds made, for example. We got to take a couple of units of stone, not many, just a few. Basic stone, I like to take Gabbro. This is the first stone I memorized in Dwarf Fortress because it had that unusual name. Gabbro is magma safe, so you can use it later in magma constructions, and it works as a workshop for forges and other uh, hot metal type workshops where you can't necessarily use any type of material you'd like. Most workshops can be built from wood, but you can't build a blacksmith's forge out of wood. So Gabbro will help us with those few workshops that we cannot build from wood to start. Let's see. Metal bars are more expensive than bringing ore. Cut gems, it's cheaper to bring the raw gems and cut them. Sand is dirt cheap. Whenever possible, bring some sand. Sand comes with a free bag. So each one of these units of sand that I'm bringing, for 1 point each, comes with a free bag. It's worth like 10 units by itself. So if I bought the bag, I'd spend 10 units. If I bought the sand, I spend 1. And I get the bag for free. So, yay! Uh, Glass, again, if I was going to make glass like green glass or crystal glass or whatever, I would take the sand and the raw materials and make the glass because it's cheaper to make the raw glass from sand, which is 1 unit, than it is to take the raw green glass, which is 6. And that's the cheapest case. Clay, we have clay on site, and notice our civilization does not have access to fire clay because it would appear here if we did. So our settlement is also the first one of our civilization to have access to porcelain without importing it. Blocks, it's cheaper to bring the raw stone and make blocks. Components, same thing, bring the raw stuff. All these finished goods, bring the raw materials. A couple of exceptions here. It's useful, sometimes at least, to bring a few units of gypsum plaster for setting bones. You probably won't care, but gypsum's a little harder to come by out of the gate, unless you just happen to have some on site. So it's not necessarily a bad idea to have some. Where did powders go? There they are. Let's see. Quicklime. I don't care about quicklime. And sugar and wheat flour. It's easier to bring the raw plants and make into those powders yourself on site. Extracts. I wouldn't bother with any of these. Most of them either aren't useful or don't have any useful function that you care about. Yes, you can have anaconda blood. No, it doesn't serve any useful function you care about. Your useful function to it is to dump it. At which point you get the barrel, but you wasted 3 units on anaconda blood when you could have spent 2 units on some type of meat you never had before, got the barrel for free the same way, spent 1 fewer unit, and gotten to eat the meat, whereas your anaconda blood is just going to waste. Crafts, toys, instruments, tools, cages, barrels, buckets, cups, flasks, quivers, backpacks, bags, all are finished goods. Don't bring any of them. Thread. Thread is the raw material for cloth. It's useful to bring some silk. In particular, cave spider silk is cheap, and bringing a few helps protect against an early mood where you might not have access to silk. It is worth noting that when it comes to plant-based cloth, there is a difference between thread made from pigtails, thread made from silk, and thread made from yarn. They are not the same thing. And you can have people who want silk or want yarn or want plants go mad, even though you have the other 2 types of cloth. Make sure you have the type they need. Plant cloth is expensive relative to silk cloth, and you can bring the pigtails and harvest them on site. Technically, there's a delay while you get your farms up and running, so it's possible that the first guy who has a moo just happens to want silk or happens to want pigtail threads before you've had a chance to make them, and you get screwed. But it doesn't happen very often, and frankly, there's other things that will screw you that you can't prevent, so don't worry about it too much. Bringing yarn is cheap, just like silk. So if you wanted to bring cave spider, not giant cave spider silk is a lot more expensive. Don't bring that stuff. But if you wanted to bring a couple units of yarn just as a precaution, that's not necessarily a bad idea. Instead of actually doing that, though, we're going to just bring the sheep and then harvest the wool on site if we actually need any. So what else do we got? We've got threads. Let's see. Sheets of paper can be made on site, and holy shit, is that stuff expensive? Don't bring it. Ropes are finished goods, splints are finished goods, crutches are finished goods, miscellaneous is technically finished goods, but lye is relatively cheap, and if you plan to make soap, it's actually cheaper to just buy it than it is to crank it out along the way. Technically, you can make the wood, bake it from just a log, but there's time investment and additional workshops, and having some lye out of the gate's not necessarily the worst idea. You can combine the lye with your fat fairly quickly to get soap up and running really early if you wanted. And soap is nice to have around for your uh, hospital. So we're going to bring a few units of lye just to have some. Again, I'm not bringing a huge amount. It's not really useful for much beyond soap. And once you've got a few bars of soap up and running and you've got a lye industry running, you're not going to need to have bunch of lye on hand. Likewise, you can get ash, and ash and lye are both used to make the materials you need, but it doesn't look like we have any ash available as a material, so we'll have to produce our own. That's kind of a pity. Bummer. But we can live. So let's talk animals, because at this point we've done skills, we've done our materials, and I'll have to review that and make sure I didn't miss anything. Let's talk animals. For animals, there's really only a few types I would normally bring. Do the fishies procreate quickly? Fishies are vermin. Okay, so all you folks asking if I'm missing coal. Yes, I am. Here's what you haven't been paying attention to. I can't bring coal. There is no coal accessible to my site. Coal does not find anything. That would be bituminous coal. There is none accessible to my civilization. Lignite is the other form of coal, and lignite is not visible to my civilization either. Our settlement will literally be the first settlement in our civilization to have access to coal at all. So all of our initial metalworking will be done with charcoal, and it will be slow and painful. That sucks, but that's the breaks. Let's see. We also under miscellaneous didn't have any ash, so apparently we're going to be the only site in the entire civilization that makes soap either, which means all of our migrants are not just unwashed migrants in the metaphorical sense, they're unwashed migrants in the most literal sense imaginable. Uh, I think that's pretty much everything I would think to bring. So some folks asking me how I would make the axe. The answer to your question is I can make the axe by taking a log, making charcoal, using the charcoal to make some bronze, use the bronze to make an axe, and I don't need any damn coal for that. Because I'm clever. Unfortunately, it's slow. It's much faster to convert coal into coke via your smelter than it is to make wood into charcoal via your wood furnace. That's much slower. So when I say that this is actually going to impact us, I mean that quite literally. We're going to probably normally I would have built a blacksmith's forge probably right there on the surface and started cranking out axes right away from a supply of coke and bronze and coal, and we'd have had metal bronze equipment rolling off the line in the first day or two. It's going to take a little longer than that for us, unfortunately. So it might be viable for us to take our two miners and dig an underground, call it burrow, for lack of a better word, where we'll produce our initial stuff and stockpile our stuff out of the sight of invaders to start with. Now, that leaves us with a fair amount of points, but the one thing we haven't talked about is animals. And as far as animals go, there's really only three types of animals I take: animals that produce milk and meat, animals that produce cloth, animals that produce eggs. Now, to be fair, that's really the only types of animals there are, but it's worth noting that there's a couple of different varieties in each of those categories, and some are better than others. So let's talk about the variations you can take. Water buffaloes and similar large ruminants are great for meat purposes. If you have a meat industry, it doesn't take many of these to have a lot of meat supply. If you've got 10 or 15 of these guys roaming around grazing and you can keep them alive, butcher a few of them, and presto, you got a ton of meat all at once. Unfortunately, they require large pasture spaces, which means low population counts, which means you won't be able to milk them as often, which means that there's some trade off there. Likewise, as you run down the ruminant list, there's quite a few in that area. Mules, donkeys, horses, cows, they're all in the same basic category. They're large four legged ruminants that provide both meat and milk. So let's skip the big ones. Let's talk about littler ones. In the littler one category, there are two that come to mind right off the bat. And the first are pigs. Pigs you would think are grazers, but they're not. So pigs can actually be pastured on raw stone and require no food. Don't ask me why, but they don't. So you can have your pigs indoors without needing to feed them. Pigs are a fantastic livestock animal for new players because they require so little input to keep them alive. Um, the downside is they don't produce anything other than meat and milk, and that's not really useful, so not really the ideal. So in addition to pigs, I will typically bring along an ewe and a ram for wool, a sow and a boar for our pigs. And that leaves us with, oh, I'm sorry, I missed a fourth category of animal, utility animals. Utility animals come in two flavors, dogs and cats. There are no other utility animals anywhere in the list to start with. That's not to say you can't use your giant desert scorpions as utility animals, but you won't start with them unless you change your raws. So you'll have to order them from, your Sears Roebuck Elf catalog. I do recommend bringing some dogs. Dogs make good guard animals. They can be butchered in a pinch if you start to run low on food. They reproduce on the fly. They require no grazing, and they are nice to have around for your dwarves. Some dwarves like animals. It's nice to take one female and one male cat and no more. You won't need additional cats. They will produce their own on site, and cats deserve special mention for another reason we'll get to in a moment. Dogs can be trained for war, so they can defend your fortress as well as keeping your dwarves happy and comfortable. Cats defend your fortress in a different way. They defend your fortress from vermin, that is to say, small flying animals that get into your food and cause unhappy thoughts on your dwarves. And occasionally, if you have unbarreled food, they can sometimes cause some rot on the food, but not really. And 99% of the time, your food's going to be in barrels where it doesn't apply anyway. So the vermin aren't really a problem in terms of your food supply, but they are an issue in terms of a keeping your dwarves happy and free of vermin supply. Vermin appear on a regular basis all over your fortress. Your cats will immediately run over and make your vermin into dead vermin, which makes your dwarves happy in the sense that they're not being exposed to live vermin on a regular basis. So, nice to have, but I wouldn't get crazy. Cats, unlike other animals, are not assigned as pets. You don't assign a cat to a dwarf. A cat assigns itself to a dwarf. Now that's bad. It sounds good because your dwarf wants a pet, right? And so it is. But pets dying is a terrible thing to happen to a dwarf. It really pisses him the fuck off in no time. And just like any other pet, you lose your cat, and cats are small, furry animals that can be stepped on by your average cave troll. Lose your cat, piss off your dwarf, and suddenly things go downhill in a hurry. Unlike normal animals, you don't have the option to keep cats from being adopted as pets. Cats adopt dwarves, not the other way around, so there's no control over limiting how many cats get to be adopted as pets. That means cats require an extreme amount of paying attention to. Otherwise, they will reproduce in large amounts and you'll get what's called a cat explosion, which will reduce your frame rate to nothing simply because you've allowed your cats to breed uncontrollably and adopt dwarves so they cannot be culled. That's right, you heard it here first. No fair culling your dwarf pets. Technically, yes, you can do it, but it requires doing something drastic like crushing them under a drawbridge. It also is going to piss off your dwarves, as we discussed earlier. So, generally speaking, the solution to that is making sure you don't have too many cats and making sure the cats you do have are not only population controlled, but that your number of pet cats is kept to a bare minimum. You're still going to get cats over time. You're still going to have to invent a solution for this down the road. But starting with fewer will push it off somewhat. So that's utility animals, meat animals, milk animals, and wool animals, but we didn't cover eggs. Now, there's two schools of thought on eggs. There's the turkey school of thought. Turkeys take 2 years to grow up instead of one, so it takes them a little longer in each cycle. But turkeys produce more eggs than other birds on average, most other birds, and produce more meat than all other birds. So they are the most productive bird over their breeding cycle. Their cycle is a little longer, however, since it takes 2 years for them to breed and grow up and breed again. So you don't get as much out of any given cycle. Typically speaking, I'm more concerned personally with my year over year production. So I will tend to use blue peacocks and blue pea hens to produce my eggs rather than turkeys. Turkeys work, and in prior fortresses, I probably even recommended them simply because they were the larger meat producer while still remaining a solid second or third category egg producer. The reality is, eggs aren't going to be a primary food source in your fortress, and meat is better had from other animals than your birds. It's sort of a bonus when it comes from the birds. So, nice to have, but not essential on the turkeys. And the 2 year cycle can be problematic if you want to have a rather more constant flow of egg production, which, if we're going to bother with eggs, I kind of want. You can look out there on the wiki to get a comparison of the number of eggs and the amount of meat that's produced by each bird, but a general rule of thumb is don't take guinea hens or guinea cocks. They don't produce anything worthwhile other than their eggs. They're too small, basically, to produce much in the way of meat. Um, Geese and turkeys are kind of similar. Geese grow up faster but don't produce as many eggs. Turkeys grow up slower but produce more meat and more eggs. Peahens are the high-end egg producers, but don't produce as much meat as turkeys and grow up in a year. That's the four types of birds: geese, turkeys, chickens. I don't think they have. Yeah, they do. Hens, roosters, and hens, chickens fall in the middle. Not the best meat producers, not the best egg producers. Don't ask me why. That's just the way it's rigged. So, typically speaking, I take blue pea hens and blue pea chicks. I'm more concerned with egg production from my egg producer than I am with the additional bonus meat. So, that's eggs, meat, milk, wool, skills, items, and I've still got 145 points left over. So, I'll turn it over to my channel. Hey guys, see anything I've missed? Anything we should be bringing that I have overlooked? Skills I should put on my dwarves that I forgot? I got 145 points to play with, and if nobody says anything, it's probably just going to go into food, drink, more ore, maybe some thread. We'll figure something out that I can take with me. But I figure I'll open it up to the stream and see if anybody's got a bright idea that I might have overlooked in the meantime. Wax working. Dude, I have beehives, and there is no way I would bother with wax working normally. Bees are a nice plus. Nothing more. Don't get me wrong, in a mature fort, it's nice to add on all these extraneous industries that are nice to have but not essential. Wax working and honey production are in that category. Nice to have, we'll get to them eventually, but not day one. Anything else, guys? Anything you can think of? Not hearing a whole lot of categories. So somebody says glass making, a point or two in sand. Somebody says points into wood burner for faster start. Actually, that's not a bad idea. I think we'll probably do that just to get us out of the gate a little quicker on that first few pieces of ore production. Our carpenter is going to be busy, and our grower and our weaponsmith are not going to have a lot to do to start. And although just get them up to adequate. Although they will have other functions, and this is not their primary. And please note for the record that, I can't do that with that guy, he's full up. Please note that there's two types of things here. Furnace operator is for your smelters, wood burner is for your wood furnaces that make charcoal. Uh, Generally speaking, I do my smelting and my wood burning in parallel with unskilled dwarves because I don't care about so much about how any individual dwarf gets done so much as there's a bunch of these jobs getting done all at once. And since I need lots and lots of ore and lots of charcoal, generally I just build 10 or 15 of these things and then say produce. And I don't care that it takes longer for each individual job to roll off because 15 of them produces faster overall. But out of the gate on the start here, we're going to make our mason and our weaponsmith into adequate wood burners just to give us a head start on. In fact, we'll go ahead and make them adequate furnace operators as well. And this is kind of wasteful in the sense that I'm spending a few points here, about 50 points, that aren't really necessary for the development of my fortress after about the first couple of weeks. But it that first couple of weeks is really when your fortress is at its most vulnerable. You have no fortifications, you have no weapons, you have no trained dwarves, you have no trained dogs, you have no traps, you have nothing covering your heads, nothing covering your walls, and a fair amount of wealth just sitting there. It wouldn't be the first fortress I'd lost to having Kia steal my anvil and 90% of my useful supplies on the first 10 seconds of the fortress. It wouldn't be the first time I've had giant gray langurs come out of the woods, kill all 7 of my dwarves, and steal all their stuff. It really does happen. And remember, as I recall, we're embarking in a really savage area, so the giant monkeys come out of the woods and kill everyone problem is actually a problem. Okay, so we've got our furnace operators, we've got our wood burners. Let's take a look through our materials, make sure I didn't forget anything I want to bring with me right away. I've got the points if I want to add an axe. I think 2 axes is too many points, but let's take a look. Yeah, copper axes are 68 a pop. That's too expensive. We'll use our malachite and our cassiterite, make some bronze ones right off the bat as fast as we can. In fact, while we're at that, why don't we do... And this is a little expensive too, but we'll go ahead and add 2 units of coke, or 3 units of coke, something like that, so that we can start our furnace reactions fast for the first couple. That'll slow down after that, but I can use 2 units of coke to do 2 bronze reactions, which will produce 8 bars of bronze each, which is enough to give us plenty of bronze to make our axes. Turn around and use the other 2 units of coke to make 2 axes, and have the same speed that I would have had out of the gate on a more traditional start where we bring coal and coke and make our own coal on site. We'll have roughly the same speed, but once it slows down, we'll also have those guys who have the skill necessary to keep up. Keep in mind, I'm doing this because this is what my civilization had. If you embarked on the other civilization, because there were 2 dwarven civilizations and we didn't choose which one, we just picked the one it gave us. If we'd chosen the other one, they might have had access to coal. They might have had access to uh, different types of ores that we would need to make bronze right out of the gate. They might have had access to bismuthinite, and I could have taken bismuth and made bismuth bronze instead of just regular bronze. Uh, While you can take a generic Embark setting anytime you like, it's entirely possible that there will be items which will not be available to that Embark setting. So I tend to custom build my Embark settings each and every time. It's a little anal. Okay, let's be honest. It's not a little anal. It's really fucking anal. But I pretty well do it every time. Just because I'm a control freak, I'm a control nut. I like having that much control. Dwarf Fortress is like my bag, baby, because it gives you control over everything. 61 points. Let's see here. What are we doing for food? We've got about 40 units of food, about 60 units of beer. That's okay. Seeds, I could take a few more, I guess. Our area has wood, so we're not going to need wood. We're not the Prometheans of our civilization stealing coal from our enemies. We are the Prometheans of our civilization discovering coal for our civilization. We're literally going to dig down and find the first coal seams in our entire civilization. That's not a joke. That's really what we're going to do. Um, let's see. I think we want to bring. I'm done with animals. I mean, I could add more dogs. It's important for any animal that you really need to breed that you take at least 2 males. The reason is because although they say male, apparently some percentage of animals are actually born asexual or gay and just won't breed. So you can have males that just won't do the job, and that really sucks if it's the only dog in your fort that can do the job. So do take a couple on any animal you actually care about having breeding ongoing. Pigs and sheep, although they'd be nice to breed, if they don't, I'll order more later. They're not essential out of the gate. Whereas dogs, I want to have them start breeding on day one. And peahens, if they don't start breeding on relatively quickly, it's hard to build up enough of them to get an egg supply going. Um, let's see. Let's hit the new button and see what's here. Mate, eggs, plants. You can bring plump helmets or garden vegetables with you, stuff that can be used to make booze, right off the bat if you want. It's a little expensive. It's cheaper to bring the seeds, make the crops, grow the plants, make the booze that way. But it's cheaper to bring the plump helmets than it is to bring the booze, because a unit of plump helmets will get you a lot more booze than just the booze you're bringing. Um, let's see here. We could take 1 dimple cup seed. I won't take more than that. Nobody will eat it. Nothing will happen to it. But that gets us access to dye right off the bat. We could grow dimple cups and make more dimple cups. Um, let's see. Don't care about gems. Don't care about all these finished goods. Are just too expensive to bother bringing. unless you're using advanced Embark points. That looks pretty good. Okay, let's back out of here. Someone suggested that I do glass making, and typically I do glass making as an unskilled labor to start. Let's see if I've got a dwarf I don't care about backing up on glass making. I normally would give it to the mason as a backup or to the grower as a backup, but in this case, I don't think I care. I think we're just going to go with it as is. 60 points. All right, so let's see. Group name. The Worthy Tome. Yeah, we'll leave that. That's good enough. But our fortress we rename all the time because I have a standard fortress name we use. Welcome to Tossiderbarium, the armored fist of artifice. And I'll save our profile. And we have no points left. Yep, let's do it.
This will be our new home.
And congratulations, kids. It's only taken 3 hours and 40 minutes to get to the point where we're actually playing the game. Now, in reality, it doesn't take a normal player that long. A lot of time. So, since it's pushing on to midnight, I'm going to pause the game here. And we're going to save right there on the spot. And we're not retiring, mind you. We are saving. If you retire your fortress, that gives it up to the NPCs. You don't want to do that. If you abandon your fortress, that's the same thing, only everybody dies, and you don't want to do that either. And this is a save and quit in the Iron Man sense. It only saves when you quit. That's going to be it for tonight's stream, because it is almost midnight, and that's way late to be doing this. So we'll come at it again tomorrow evening, and we'll pick up where we left off. 32 more days to go, guys. This is 33 days of Dwarf, 1 day down. So, if you've got creative suggestions for future forts that you'd like to see, things that you might like to have down the road, I've got 33 days to figure it out and learn it before I actually have to implement it somewhere. So go ahead and ask, but fair warning, I'm not planning to do anything involving calculators and pressure plates, and if it starts to look like you're doing computer science instead of playing Dwarf Fortress, you're a bridge too far for my stream. Go find a dwarven mechanical engineer. Not saying I won't implement minecart traps or the like, but there's going to be some limits to the kinds of shenanigans I get up to, strictly from the standpoint of I'm trying to teach people how to play, not teach people how to play at the supermost expert level. Oh, don't worry. Our fortress will have a library, fear not. Because libraries, like temples and taverns, are kind of nice to have for your dwarves to be able to go there and reduce some of their stress a little. But over and above, that's the gist of it. That's how you get Dwarf Fortress set up to the point where it's ready to play. I know that first fortress, that first night of stream isn't real exciting while I walk through things like init files and setup options, but understanding how those things work allows you to configure Dwarf Fortress for your own personal experience the way you like it. So it's kind of important to know how to do those things. So tomorrow night, we're looking at 7:30, 8 o'clock, and we're going to shoot for 7:30, but I'll post out there on Reddit exactly what time if we're not going to start at 7:30. And we'll run for an hour or two, and we'll do that every night until Saturday. Saturday I'll give you a couple hours on Saturday, but I have a couple things a couple times a month on Saturdays I can't run long. So our long sessions will tend to be on Sundays for the next 33 days. With the sole exception being November 2nd. On November 2nd, as part of the Extra Life charity drive, I will be on stream for 24 hours beginning at about 8 a.m. on the 2nd and running through 8 a.m. on the 3rd. And we will do 33 days of Dwarf, finishing with that event. Now, the reason I'm doing all this is not just to teach Dwarf Fortress, that's a nice bonus. The whole point to all this is that I'm actually doing it to collect money for a charity to help sick kids. I don't get any of this money. I'm not collecting it for me. I don't want it. But if you're looking out there below my stream, down at the bottom, you're going to find links out there to the donation page for Extra Life. And the entire purpose of this stream is to collect money for sick kids for a children's hospital that treats them for free if they need it. When I was a kid, I was actually born with a club foot, and Riley Hospital here in my city was responsible for teaching my mother how to perform the necessary physical therapy to correct my club foot over time. She spent many hours bending my foot into the appropriate position so that my ankle muscles would stretch as necessary for me to be able to walk properly as an adult. And in my eyes, it's not just about giving back, but because these are the kinds of folks who really need it. So what we've run into is an intersection between a guy who likes to game, who was helped by a children's hospital that needs to collect money, and a charity that collects money for children's hospitals by having people play games, which is Extra Life. So this all kind of comes around in a neat circle. For those of you who are interested in donating, if you donate in this event anytime in the next 33 days and you ask, a donation of at least $10 will get a dwarf named after you in that fort and every fort thereafter. So if you donate today, every fort from this fort on will show up. I'll nickname a dwarf after whatever you want, as long as it's not super vulgar or offensive, and we'll run with it. If you donate $25, I'll make it one of my first starting 7 in every fort for the next 33 days. So you'll be one of the first dwarves into the fort for the rest of the event. There are a couple of other donation tiers I've got out there for folks who are really feeling their oats and want to donate a chunk of money, including I will let you pick the subject of the fort, and I will let you change which game I'm playing if you really want to. But those things kind of require a bit more of a donation out of you than just picking a dwarf or having a dwarf named after you. So if you're feeling your oats, by all means, feel free to hop out there in the Dwarf Fortress subreddit and find the 33 Days of Dwarf posts, and there will probably be a couple at this point. Decide if you want to donate at one of those tiers and donate. Provide in the donation in your donation message what you want your dwarf to be named, and away we go. If you're thinking you'd like me to play something else for a while and you want to crank out that donation, by all means, you can contact me there as well. Otherwise, guys, my intent is to see you all tomorrow at about 7:30 or 8 p.m. Eastern. Keep your eyes peeled on Reddit for when the actual stream will be, and I will see you then.